Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might lull you into the deepest sleep of your life, the utterly exhausting reality of surviving World War I. We're diving into what life was really like for the millions of young men who got handed a rifle and told to fix Europe's problems with violence, probably because diplomatic solutions required too much paperwork and nobody had invented PowerPoint presentations yet. Forget the glory and heroism Hollywood sold you. Those were marketing materials designed by people who never had to explain to their mothers why they came home missing limbs or sanity. The truth is, if you were dropped into the trenches of the Western Front, you probably wouldn't last a day, let alone the 4 years this nightmare lasted. You'd be dead faster than a German machine gunner could say Guten Tag. And believe me, they weren't particularly chatty. So before you get comfortable in your modern bed, with its miracle of memory foam and the revolutionary concept of indoor plumbing, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the lives of people who never got to see the world because they were too busy dying in muddy holes for reasons their politicians couldn't clearly explain. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. A journey through mud, poison gas, and the kind of survival that makes your worst Monday morning look like a luxury spa vacation hosted by someone who actually cares about your well-being. Congratulations, you've been born in 1896 in a small farming village somewhere in rural France. Your name is Henry, and you're currently 18 years old, which in 1914 means you're exactly the right age to become cannon fodder for a war that started because someone shot an Austrian duke you'd never heard of in a place you couldn't find on a map. But don't worry about geography lessons. You won't need them where you're going. You wake up on July 28th, 1914, to the sound of church bells ringing with unusual urgency. It's not Sunday, which means either someone important died or someone important decided other people should die. Your mother, Marie, is standing in the doorway of your small stone cottage, holding a piece of paper that arrived with unusual speed for a government that usually moves slower than your neighbour's arthritic ox. "Henri," she says, her voice carrying that particular tone mothers use when they're about to deliver news that will fundamentally alter your existence. "You need to report to the town square by noon." You sit up in your straw mattress, which is about as comfortable as sleeping on a pile of angry cats, and realize that the paper in her hands is probably your conscription notice. In 1914, military service isn't optional. It's more like a subscription service you never signed up for but can't cancel. And the consequences of trying to unsubscribe involve firing squads and very disappointed generals. What does it say? You ask. Though you already know the answer will involve marching, shouting, and significantly more violence than your current career of growing turnips and occasionally fixing the roof when storms knock holes in it. Your mother unfolds the paper with the care usually reserved for handling angry wasps. It says you're needed to defend the honor of France against German aggression. She reads, then looks up with eyes that suggest she understands exactly how much defending the honor of France typically costs in terms of sons who don't come home for Christmas dinner. You get dressed in your only good clothes, which consist of wool pants that itch like they're inhabited by tiny demons, and a cotton shirt that's been washed so many times it's achieved the texture of paper that's been chewed by goats. Your father, Pierre, hands you a small cloth bag containing some bread, cheese, and a wooden cross that belonged to his father, who coincidentally also went off to war and came back with stories he never told and nightmares he never explained. Try not to die, he says, which is possibly the most practical advice anyone will give you for the next 4 years, assuming you live that long. You walk to the town square along dirt roads that will seem luxuriously smooth compared to the muddy nightmare landscapes you're about to inhabit. The square is filled with young men who look exactly as confused and terrified as you feel, which is somehow both comforting and deeply unsettling. There's Jean-Baptiste, the baker's son, who's 19, and has never been more than 10 kilometers from home. There's Marcel, the blacksmith's apprentice, who's 20 and strong enough to bend horseshoes but probably not strong enough to bend bullets. A sergeant named Dubois stands on a wooden crate, shouting instructions with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believes that volume equals authority. He's maybe 35 years old, which makes him practically ancient by military standards, and he has the kind of mustache that suggests he takes himself very seriously indeed. "Gentlemen!" Dubois shouts, though you suspect his definition of gentleman is considerably more generous than most people's. "You have been called to serve your country in its hour of need. The Germans have violated Belgian neutrality, and it is our sacred duty to march to Berlin and teach them the meaning of French resolve." Someone in the crowd, probably Marcel, raises his hand like this is school and asks, "How long will we be gone?" Dubois grins with the confidence of someone who has access to information that will prove laughably incorrect. "We'll be home by Christmas, boys. This will be over before the leaves change color." You look around at the other faces and realize that everyone believes this, including you, because the alternative believing this might last years is too horrible to consider. Nobody mentions that it's currently late July, which gives you about 5 months to march to Berlin, defeat the German army, and return home in time to help with the winter wheat planting. The next 6 weeks pass in a blur of training that would be comical if it weren't so inadequate. You learn to march in formation, which is useful if your enemies politely agree to stand still while you approach them in neat rows. You learn to use a rifle, specifically the Lebel rifle, which was modern and impressive in 1886, but is now roughly equivalent to bringing a telescope to a microscope convention. Your training takes place at a camp outside Lyon, where you sleep in tents that leak when it rains and turn into ovens when it doesn't. The food consists mainly of bread that could double as building material, and soup that tastes like someone dissolved sadness in warm water. You lose about 10 pounds, which your mother would worry about if she knew, but you're not allowed to tell her, because military censors read all letters, and apparently honesty about army food is considered bad for morale. Jean-Baptiste, who sleeps in the tent next to yours, develops what the medics cheerfully call dysentery, but what you and your digestive system recognize as your body's revolt against military cuisine. He spends most of August running to the latrines, which are holes in the ground that smell like concentrated human misery and attract flies with the dedication of religious pilgrims. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," Jean-Baptiste whispers one night as you're both lying on your thin blankets, listening to someone in another tent crying quietly because he misses his girlfriend. "None of us are cut out for this," you whisper back, which is probably the most honest thing anyone has said since you all arrived at camp. Marcel, meanwhile, has adapted to army life with the resilience of someone who spent his youth hammering metal into useful shapes. He can march 20 kilometers without complaining, hit targets at 50 meters with reasonable accuracy, and has somehow convinced himself that this adventure will make him more attractive to women when he returns home. Think about the stories we'll have. Marcel says during one of your brief rest periods, while you're all sitting around cleaning rifles that will be dirty again within hours. Think about how impressed everyone will be when we come back. You think about this, but mostly you think about how impressed everyone will be if you come back, which is starting to seem like a significant if, rather than a comfortable when. On September 2nd, 1914, you receive orders to move out. You're part of the Second Army under General de Castelnau, though you have no idea who that is or why you should care about his opinions on military strategy. What you do know is that you're heading east toward the German border, carrying about 30 kilograms of equipment that seemed reasonable when you were standing still, but becomes progressively more unreasonable with every kilometer you march. Your pack contains ammunition, food rations, a water bottle, a blanket, spare clothes, cleaning supplies for your rifle, and various items that some staff officer decided were essential for modern warfare. The total weight is roughly equivalent to carrying a medium-sized child on your back, except children don't have sharp metal edges that dig into your spine when you move wrong. The first day of marching covers 25 kilometers through countryside that would be beautiful if you weren't too exhausted to appreciate it. Your feet, which have spent their entire lives in wooden shoes designed for standing in fields, rebel against military boots designed by someone who apparently never had feet. By evening, you have blisters on your blisters, and Jean-Baptiste is limping like someone who's been personally cursed by the god of comfortable walking. "How much farther?" asks a recruit whose name you never learned, but whose face perfectly captures the expression of someone who's beginning to suspect this might not be the glorious adventure the recruitment posters promised. Sergeant Dubois, who's riding a horse because apparently marching is only character building for people who aren't sergeants, calls back, "We'll reach the front lines within the week." Keep your spirits up, boys. Think of the German soldiers who are probably marching toward us right now, just as tired and miserable as you are. This is supposed to be encouraging, but you find it oddly comforting to imagine German soldiers somewhere else having the same conversation in a different language, complaining about their own feet and wondering why adults couldn't solve their problems without making teenagers walk hundreds of kilometers to shoot each other. By September 10th, you've reached the Marne River, and you're about to participate in what historians will later call the First Battle of the Marne, though right now it just feels like organized chaos with artillery sounds. The battle lasts from September 6th to September 12th, and your role in it consists mainly of following orders you don't understand, while trying not to get killed by enemies you can't see. Your first experience of actual combat happens when your unit is ordered to advance across an open field toward a tree line where German machine gunners have set up positions. This is approximately as safe as it sounds, which is to say not safe at all. The Maxim machine guns the Germans use can fire 600 rounds per minute, which means they can kill more people in 60 seconds than your entire village contains. "Fix bayonets!" shouts Lieutenant Moreau, a recent graduate of Saint-Cyr Military Academy who's 22 years old and has approximately the same amount of combat experience as your village cat. "We're going over the top." You attach your bayonet to your rifle with hands that shake slightly, not from fear, but from the rational recognition that running toward machine guns is probably not the optimal survival strategy. Jean-Baptiste is next to you, looking pale green, which is either terror or his dysentery making a comeback at the worst possible moment. "On my whistle!" Moreau shouts, holding up a small metal whistle like it's some kind of magical artifact that will protect you from physics and German engineering. The whistle blows, and you run. Running across an open field while people shoot at you is exactly as unpleasant as you'd expect, multiplied by factors you never considered. The machine gun fire creates a sound like someone ripping enormous pieces of fabric very quickly. Bullets hit the ground around you with wet, thudding sounds that suggest the earth is being systematically murdered. Men fall down and don't get up, which is the kind of educational experience that really drives home the point about mortality being non-negotiable. You make it about 50 meters before diving behind a small ridge that provides cover approximately equivalent to hiding behind a particularly sturdy dandelion. Jean-Baptiste lands next to you, breathing hard and making small whimpering sounds that perfectly capture your own internal emotional state. "What do we do now?" he gasps, which is an excellent question that nobody seems equipped to answer. Marcel, who somehow made it to the same ridge, points toward the German positions and says, "I think we're supposed to keep going." You look toward the tree line, where muzzle flashes indicate that German soldiers are continuing their commitment to shooting anyone who moves. Then you look back toward your own lines, where more French soldiers are preparing to run across the same field that just proved to be an excellent place to get killed. Lieutenant Moreau's whistle blows again, and the second wave of your attack begins. You watch men you've trained with for 6 weeks run into machine gun fire with the same result as the first wave, which is that they fall down and don't get up. This strikes you as poor strategy, but you're just a conscripted farmer who until recently specialized in turnips rather than tactics. "We have to move," Marcel says, which is true but unhelpful given that moving appears to be synonymous with dying. You spend the next 4 hours behind your ridge, occasionally shooting at German positions you can't really see, while German soldiers occasionally shoot back at French positions they probably can't see either. This continues until darkness falls, and someone with more authority than common sense decides that both sides should stop shooting and try again tomorrow. The retreat back to your own lines happens under cover of darkness, which makes it slightly less suicidal but significantly more confusing. You crawl, run, and stumble through mud that's been churned up by artillery shells and mixed with things you don't want to identify. Jean-Baptiste falls into a shell crater and emerges covered in mud that smells like a combination of explosives and human despair. When you finally reach your own trenches, which are shallow ditches that someone optimistically calls defensive positions, you collapse against the dirt wall and try to process what just happened. Your unit started the day with 60 men and finished with 42, which represents an 18-person lesson in the mathematical relationship between machine guns and human bodies. Sergeant Dubois, who spent the battle safely behind the lines coordinating communication, approaches your group with the cheerful demeanor of someone who didn't just watch his friends get shot. "Good work today, boys," he announces. "We showed the Germans what French soldiers are made of." Marcel, who's sitting next to you cleaning mud out of his rifle, mutters under his breath, "Apparently we're made of the same stuff as everyone else. We bleed and die just like everybody." You're too tired to laugh, but you appreciate the observation. The next morning brings your introduction to trench warfare, which will define your existence for the next 4 years, assuming you survive that long. The trenches are narrow ditches connected by communication tunnels, designed to provide protection from enemy fire while allowing soldiers to shoot back. In theory, this sounds reasonable. In practice, trenches are muddy holes filled with rats, disease, and the persistent smell of human waste mixed with rotting sandbags. Your section of trench is about 2 meters deep and 1 meter wide, which gives you just enough room to stand upright if you're shorter than average, or crouch uncomfortably if you're not. The walls are reinforced with wooden planks and sandbags, both of which are in various stages of decay thanks to rain, artillery, and time. The floor is covered with wooden planks called duckboards, which are supposed to keep your feet out of the mud, but mostly just provide something solid to stand on while mud seeps up between the cracks. Jean-Baptiste, who's been assigned to the same section, looks around at your new accommodation and says, "This is worse than my family's pig pen." You're inclined to agree, but then you remember that pig pens don't usually have people shooting at them, so the comparison isn't entirely fair to pig pens. Your daily routine in the trenches follows a schedule designed by people who clearly never had to live in trenches. You wake up before dawn for what's called stand to, which involves everyone manning the firing positions in case the Germans decide to attack at sunrise. This happens rarely, but military tradition demands that you assume it will happen every day, just in case the Germans suddenly develop a sense of predictability. After stand to, you clean your rifle, which gets dirty again within hours thanks to mud, rain, and the general hostility of the environment toward mechanical devices. Then you eat breakfast, which consists of coffee that tastes like someone dissolved disappointment in hot water and bread that could be used as emergency building material. The rest of your day involves taking turns on watch duty, where you peer over the trench wall through periscopes or through gaps between sandbags, looking for German soldiers doing exactly the same thing you are. Occasionally, someone sees movement and shoots at it. More occasionally, someone gets shot. Most of the time, nothing happens except that everyone gets a little more tired and a little more convinced that this is a stupid way to resolve international disputes. Private Rousseau, who joined your unit after the Marne battle, has been in the trenches for 3 weeks and has developed the philosophical outlook of someone who's spent too much time thinking about mortality while standing in mud. "You know what I realized?" he says during one of your quiet moments, while you're both cleaning equipment that will be dirty again within hours. "This whole war is just 2 groups of people hiding in holes, shooting at each other because their governments couldn't agree on something none of us understand." "What couldn't they agree on?" Jean-Baptiste asks, which is a reasonable question that nobody seems able to answer clearly. Rousseau shrugs. Something about Serbia and Austria and Germany and Russia and France and Britain all having agreements with each other that required them to fight if someone else fought someone else. It's like when children make rules for games that get so complicated nobody remembers why they're playing. You think about this while watching German soldiers in their trenches about 200 meters away, doing exactly the same things you're doing for exactly the same unclear reasons. They're probably also cold, tired, muddy, and confused about why adults couldn't solve their problems without involving teenagers with rifles. Marcel, who's been unusually quiet since the Marne battle, suddenly speaks up. "My brother wrote to me last week. He said the newspapers back home are calling this a glorious crusade for civilization." "What do you think?" Jean-Baptiste asks. Marcel gestures around at the trench, which currently contains 3 rats, 2 inches of standing water, and the persistent smell of sanitation systems that gave up trying. "I think civilization might want to reconsider its definition of glorious. October brings rain, which transforms the trenches from unpleasant living conditions into something resembling aquatic torture, designed by people who hate the concept of dry clothing. The rain falls steadily for 2 weeks, turning the dirt floors into mud, the mud into swamps, and the swamps into something that defies geological classification. Your boots, which were designed for marching on solid ground, prove completely inadequate for standing in water mixed with mud and human waste. Within 3 days, your feet develop a condition the medics call trench foot, which is a medical term for what happens when human extremities spend too much time in conditions that would kill plants. Trench foot begins with your feet feeling cold and numb, which sounds pleasant until you realize that numbness is your body's way of preparing you for tissue death. Then your feet swell up like inflated balloons, turn colors that feet shouldn't turn, and start smelling like something that died and then died again just to make a point. Jean-Baptiste, whose feet have achieved an impressive purple color that would be beautiful on flowers but is concerning on human body parts, limps to the medical station for treatment. The medic, a tired-looking man named Corporal Blanchard, who's been dealing with trench foot cases for months, examines Jean-Baptiste's feet with the expression of someone who's seen this particular horror show many times before. "How long have they been like this?" Blanchard asks, though the answer is probably obvious from the smell. "About a week," Jean-Baptiste replies, trying not to look at his own feet because the sight of them is almost as disturbing as the feeling. Blanchard nods and begins cleaning Jean-Baptiste's feet with antiseptic that stings enough to make him yelp. "You need to keep these dry and clean," he says, which is advice roughly equivalent to suggesting that fish should avoid water. "How am I supposed to keep them dry when I'm standing in a trench full of water?" Jean-Baptiste asks, which is a reasonable question that highlights the fundamental disconnect between medical theory and trench reality. "Do your best," Blanchard replies, which is military medical advice for situations where the recommended treatment is impossible given current circumstances. Meanwhile, you're developing your own foot problems, plus a cough that started as a minor irritation and has progressed to something that sounds like your lungs are auditioning for roles in a tuberculosis awareness campaign. The combination of cold, wet conditions, poor nutrition, and stress has turned your immune system into something roughly as effective as a chocolate defense against rain. Marcel, who somehow maintains better health than the rest of your group, has developed a theory about trench survival that he shares during one of your rest periods. "The secret," he says, while cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time today, "is to accept that everything is terrible and then be pleasantly surprised when something isn't actively trying to kill you." "That's a depressing way to look at life," Rousseau observes. "Life is depressing," Marcel replies. "But if you expect it to be depressing, then dry socks become a celebration instead of a basic human right. You consider this philosophy while trying to find a position where you can sleep without water dripping on your face. The trenches don't really have comfortable sleeping areas. They have areas where you can lie down and be slightly less uncomfortable than when you're standing up. Your bed is a wooden shelf built into the trench wall, covered with a thin blanket that's about as waterproof as a screen door. Sleep in the trenches is an intermittent activity punctuated by artillery shells, sniper fire, and the sounds of rats conducting what appears to be organized warfare against your food supplies. The rats have adapted to trench life better than the humans. They're enormous, fearless, and apparently capable of eating anything, including soap, leather, and food that's been specifically treated to prevent rat consumption. Private Moreau, not the lieutenant, just a coincidence of surnames, who sleeps in the section next to yours, has declared war on the rats with the intensity usually reserved for international conflicts. He's constructed elaborate traps, tried various poisons, and once spent an entire night hunting them with a bayonet, which was entertaining but ultimately ineffective. "I killed 6 of them last night," he announces proudly during breakfast, while eating bread that shows obvious signs of rat teeth marks. "How many do you think are left?" you ask, watching a particularly large rat drag a piece of cheese across the trench floor in broad daylight, apparently unconcerned by human presence. Moreau looks around at the trenches, where rats scurry freely between sandbags, through communication tunnels, and occasionally across sleeping soldiers who've given up trying to maintain rat-free sleeping areas. "All of them," he admits. "I think I'm losing." November brings the first serious German attack on your section of the line. It begins at 4:30 in the morning with an artillery barrage that makes previous bombardments seem like gentle percussion music. The shells fall with mechanical precision, each one creating a crater, a cloud of smoke, and a sound like the world ending in installments. You huddle in your dugout, which is a reinforced hole carved into the trench wall, while shells explode close enough to shake dirt from the ceiling onto your helmet. Jean-Baptiste is next to you, praying in Latin, which he learned from the village priest and apparently retained despite years of religious skepticism. "Pater noster quis in caelis," he mutters, while explosions outside suggest that heaven might be temporarily unavailable for prayer processing. Marcel sits across from you, methodically checking his rifle and ammunition with the calm efficiency of someone who's decided that panic is less useful than preparation. "How long do these barrages usually last?" he asks, though nobody in your group has enough experience to provide reliable artillery scheduling information. Sergeant Dubois, who's sharing your dugout because NCO privileges don't extend to private bombardment shelters, consults his pocket watch and says, "Could be anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours. Depends on how much ammunition the Germans want to waste before they send their infantry." A shell explodes close enough to collapse part of the trench wall about 10 meters from your position. You hear someone screaming, but the sound is muffled by artillery noise and the general cacophony of things exploding in rapid succession. "Somebody should help. Whoever that is," Rousseau says, though nobody moves because going outside during an artillery barrage is approximately as safe as juggling dynamite while riding a bicycle through a hurricane. The barrage continues for 90 minutes, during which you have plenty of time to contemplate mortality, eternity, and the curious human tendency to solve disagreements with explosives. When it finally stops, the silence is almost as disturbing as the noise was, because silence means the German infantry attack is about to begin. "Stand to," Dubois shouts, and you emerge from your dugout into a trench that's been significantly remodeled by German artillery. Several sections have collapsed completely, creating gaps that will need to be defended by soldiers rather than earthworks. The smell of explosives hangs in the air like industrial perfume, mixed with dust and things you don't want to identify. You take your position at the firing step, which is a wooden platform that lets you see over the trench wall without exposing too much of your body to German marksmanship. Through the gaps in your sandbag wall, you can see German soldiers emerging from their trenches about 200 meters away, beginning their advance across the space between the opposing lines that everyone calls No Man's Land. No Man's Land is an appropriate name for the area between the trenches, because it's a landscape specifically designed to kill any man who enters it. Artillery has churned the ground into a moonscape of craters, broken trees, and mud mixed with debris from previous battles. Barbed wire stretches across the area in multiple rows, designed to slow down attacking infantry long enough for defenders to shoot them more efficiently. The German soldiers advance in lines, just like you did at the Marne, which suggests that military tactics haven't evolved much since people figured out that machine guns are effective at killing people who run toward them in predictable patterns. Wait for the order to fire, Dubois instructs. Though you can see German soldiers getting closer with every second, and waiting seems like a strategy designed by someone who enjoys unnecessary suspense. Lieutenant Moreau, who's somehow survived 3 months of combat without learning anything useful about military leadership, stands up on the firing step to get a better view of the advancing Germans. This provides German snipers with an excellent target, which they take advantage of immediately. The lieutenant falls backward into the trench, with a surprised expression and a hole in his forehead that suggests his military career has reached an abrupt conclusion. He doesn't say anything meaningful before dying, which is disappointing because you'd hope for some kind of inspiring final words or at least useful tactical advice. "Well," Marcel observes, while stepping over the lieutenant's body to take a better firing position, "I guess we're in charge of ourselves now." Dubois apparently agrees, because he starts giving orders with the authority of someone who's just been promoted by default. "Fire at will," he shouts, which is military language for shooting German soldiers before they get close enough to shoot you. You aim your rifle at the advancing Germans and fire. The Lebel rifle kicks against your shoulder hard enough to leave bruises, and the smoke from the gunpowder obscures your vision for several seconds. By the time you can see clearly again, you've reloaded, and the Germans are noticeably closer, which suggests that your marksmanship needs improvement, or that there are more Germans than you have bullets. Jean-Baptiste, who's firing from the position next to yours, seems to be having similar accuracy issues. "I think I missed," he says, which is probably true given that the German soldier he was aiming at is still running toward your trench with obvious hostile intent. "Keep shooting," Marcel advises, which is practical advice even if it's not a particularly sophisticated military strategy. The battle continues for about 40 minutes, during which you fire approximately 30 rounds, reload your rifle more times than you can count, and develop a much clearer understanding of why military medical services stay busy during wartime. German soldiers fall down and don't get up, French soldiers fall down and don't get up, and you begin to suspect that this entire conflict might be less about strategy and more about which side runs out of people first. Eventually, the surviving German soldiers retreat to their own trenches, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead scattered across no man's land like grim decorations. You've successfully defended your position, which means you get to stay in your muddy hole and do this again tomorrow or next week, or whenever the Germans decide they haven't lost enough people yet. The aftermath of the battle involves counting casualties, which is a depressing mathematical exercise that highlights the relationship between military success and human cost. Your section started the day with 28 men and finished with 22, representing a 6-person lesson in why defensive positions only work if you have enough people to defend them. Corporal Blanchard, the medic, moves through the trench, treating wounded soldiers with supplies that are inadequate for the number of injuries requiring attention. He's been working without a break for 6 hours, and his uniform is covered with blood that belongs to other people, which is the kind of work experience that probably wasn't covered in medical school. "How's everyone holding up?" he asks, while bandaging a soldier whose name you don't know but whose arm is bent in directions that arms shouldn't bend. "We're alive," Rousseau replies, which is accurate but sets a pretty low standard for holding up. "That's better than some," Blanchard observes, gesturing toward the covered bodies lined up along one wall of the trench, waiting for burial details that will happen when someone finds time between defensive preparations and medical emergencies. You help carry the wounded to the aid station, which is a dugout equipped with medical supplies and lit by oil lamps that cast shadows in ways that make everything look more ominous than it already is. The wounded soldiers lie on stretchers, waiting for transportation to field hospitals that are hopefully better equipped than the aid station but probably not significantly more comfortable. Private Durand, who caught a piece of artillery shrapnel in his leg, grabs your arm as you help move his stretcher. "Write to my mother," he says, though you don't know his mother or where she lives or what you're supposed to tell her about her son's current medical situation. What should I tell her? You ask. Which seems like a reasonable question given that military censorship probably limits your letter-writing options. Tell her I'm fine, Durand replies, though his leg is currently held together with bandages and optimism, which doesn't seem particularly fine by most definitions. You promise to write to his mother, though you're not sure how to explain that he's fine while also explaining why he's in a military hospital with injuries that might require amputation. Military correspondence requires a level of creative writing that they didn't teach in your village school. December brings snow, which transforms the trenches from muddy holes into frozen muddy holes, with the added entertainment value of hypothermia. The temperature drops below freezing and stays there, turning the standing water in your trench into ice and making your morning routine significantly more challenging. Your water bottles freeze solid, which means you start each day by melting ice over small fires built in metal containers that barely produce enough heat to warm your hands, let alone your entire body. Your food rations freeze into blocks that require tools to break apart, and eating becomes a process of chewing ice-cold bread while trying not to think about how much you miss warm meals. Jean-Baptiste, whose feet never fully recovered from his trench foot experience, develops what Corporal Blanchard cheerfully diagnoses as frostbite, which is medical terminology for when body parts give up, trying to maintain circulation, and start dying in protest. I can't feel my toes, Jean-Baptiste reports, which sounds pleasant until you realize that not feeling your toes means your toes might not anymore. Blanchard examines Jean-Baptiste's feet, which have turned colors that would look good on winter landscapes, but are concerning when they appear on human extremities. We need to get you to a field hospital, he says, which is medical language for situations that exceed dugout first aid capabilities. How long will that take? Jean-Baptiste asks, though transportation to field hospitals depends on availability of stretcher bearers, medical vehicles, and roads that haven't been destroyed by artillery bombardments. Could be a few hours, could be a few days, Blanchard replies, which is medical honesty about logistical realities that don't prioritize patient convenience. Jean-Baptiste spends the next 3 days waiting for medical evacuation while his feet progressively demonstrate why human bodies weren't designed for prolonged exposure to freezing mud. By the time stretcher bearers arrive to transport him to the field hospital, his toes have achieved colors that suggest they're no longer participating in his circulatory system. Write to me when you get home, he says as they carry him away, though you both understand that getting home requires surviving long enough to be discharged from military service, which seems like an optimistic assumption given current circumstances. You watch him disappear down the communication trench and realize that your group of friends from training camp is being systematically reduced by mathematical processes that don't care about friendship, shared experiences, or promises to write letters. Marcel, who somehow maintained better health than the rest of your original group, has developed a philosophical approach to winter trench warfare that he shares during one of your rest periods. I've figured out the secret to staying warm, he announces, while huddled under every blanket he can find and still shivering visibly. What's the secret, you ask, though you suspect his definition of warm might be different from yours. Lower your standards, Marcel replies. If you expect to be comfortable, you'll be miserable. If you expect to be miserable, then not dying of hypothermia feels like luxury. This philosophy proves useful during the January offensive, when your unit is ordered to attack German positions during a blizzard that reduces visibility to about 10 meters and makes walking in straight lines nearly impossible. The attack is scheduled for dawn, which in January means you'll be advancing toward enemy positions in darkness, through snow, while German soldiers shoot at you from heated bunkers. The pre-attack briefing takes place in a dugout that's barely large enough for the officers and NCOs who need to attend, which means most of the information filters down to regular soldiers through a game of military telephone that inevitably distorts important details. Captain Rousseau, no relation to the Private Rousseau in your unit, who replaced Lieutenant Moreau after his unfortunate encounter with German marksmanship, explains the attack plan with the confidence of someone who's studied maps, but never tried to implement map theory in blizzard conditions. "Gentlemen," Captain Rousseau begins, unfolding a map that shows neat lines and clear objectives, but doesn't indicate snow depth or German machine gun positions. "We'll be advancing across approximately 400 meters of open ground to capture the German forward trenches." Sergeant Dubois raises his hand like this is a classroom discussion rather than a briefing about running toward people who want to kill you. "Sir, what about the weather conditions?" Captain Rousseau glances toward the dugout entrance, where snow is falling with the determination of nature trying to bury everything under white silence. "The weather will provide concealment from German observation," he says, which is military optimism for situations where visibility works both ways, and you can't see the people shooting at you any better than they can see you. You receive your orders along with extra ammunition, a piece of chocolate that's frozen solid enough to break teeth, and advice to stay low while advancing, which is tactical guidance, roughly equivalent to suggesting that water is wet and fire is hot. The attack begins at 5:30 in the morning, during a blizzard that makes the previous December snowfalls look like gentle dusting. You climb out of your trench into snow that's knee-deep and wind that cuts through your uniform like it's made of paper. The temperature is approximately 20 degrees below freezing, which means exposed skin starts dying within minutes, and your rifle becomes so cold that touching metal parts without gloves removes layers of skin. Marcel, who's been assigned to advance next to you, looks around at the weather conditions and shouts over the wind, "This is insane." You're inclined to agree, but military service doesn't typically involve polling soldiers about the sanity of orders before implementing them. You start walking toward the German lines, following compass directions that become increasingly theoretical as the blizzard erases landmarks and makes navigation approximately as reliable as guessing. The snow muffles most sounds, which means you can't hear German machine guns until bullets start hitting the ground around you, creating small explosions of snow that would be pretty if they weren't indicators of people trying to kill you. The blizzard that's supposed to provide concealment also conceals German positions, which means you're walking through a white maze where enemies could be anywhere and you won't see them until you're close enough to shake hands. Private Girard, who's advancing about 10 meters to your left, suddenly falls down and doesn't get up, which suggests he's encountered German defensive measures that don't require visibility to be effective. You can't see what happened to him because the snow is falling too heavily, but the red stain spreading around his position in the snow provides sufficient context. "Keep moving!" Dubois shouts from somewhere behind you, though his voice is distorted by wind and distance until it sounds like someone giving advice from the bottom of a well. You continue advancing through snow that gets deeper with every step, toward German positions you can't see, while carrying equipment that gets heavier as your muscles tire and your body heat disappears into the surrounding cold. Your rifle, which was difficult to operate in normal conditions, becomes nearly impossible to manage with frozen fingers and mechanical parts that don't function properly at sub-zero temperatures. After about 20 minutes of walking through what appears to be a frozen nightmare designed by people who hate the concept of human survival, you encounter German barbed wire, which has been thoughtfully placed to catch advancing soldiers at approximately chest height. The wire is covered with snow, making it nearly invisible until you walk into it, at which point it becomes extremely visible and personally relevant. Marcel, who encounters the wire at roughly the same time you do, tries to climb over it and gets his uniform caught on metal barbs that are apparently designed to grab fabric and hold onto it with the determination of mechanical parasites. "I'm stuck," he announces, while struggling against wire that seems to tighten around him with every movement. You try to help him get unstuck, but your fingers are too cold to work effectively, and the wire cutters you're supposed to carry have disappeared somewhere in your equipment, probably buried under layers of snow and frozen accessories that seemed important when you left your trench. German soldiers, who have apparently been watching your struggle with their wire obstacles, begin shooting at you from positions you still can't see. Bullets hit the snow around you with soft, thudding sounds that suggest German marksmanship is less affected by weather conditions than French navigation skills. We need to go back. You tell Marcel, who's still caught in wire, that refuses to release him despite his increasingly creative French vocabulary. I can't move, Marcel replies, which is accurate but unhelpful, given that staying in your current position seems likely to result in German soldiers using you for target practice until you stop providing entertainment value. You manage to cut Marcel free using your bayonet, which works better than wire cutters, but requires getting close enough to German positions that you can hear them talking to each other in a language you don't understand but recognize as distinctly unfriendly. The retreat back to your own trenches happens through the same blizzard, over the same impossible terrain, while German soldiers continue shooting at you with the persistence of people who take their job seriously. You and Marcel help carry Private Girard, who's still alive but bleeding from wounds that suggest German bullets are more effective than French winter uniforms. By the time you reach your own trenches, the attack has been officially classified as unsuccessful, which is military terminology for situations where objectives weren't achieved and casualties exceeded expectations. Your unit started the attack with 37 men and returned with 29, representing an 8-person lesson in why attacking during blizzards might not be an optimal military strategy. Corporal Blanchard, who's been waiting in the aid station with medical supplies and the expression of someone who expected casualties, treats Private Girard's wounds while explaining battlefield medicine to anyone who's interested in learning about trauma care under suboptimal conditions. The bullet went through his shoulder without hitting major blood vessels. Blanchard explains, while cleaning wounds that are frozen enough to require thawing before proper medical treatment. He'll live, but he won't be carrying heavy equipment for a while. Girard, who's conscious but pale from blood loss and cold exposure, looks around at the aid station and asks, "Did we win?" You look at Marcel, who looks at Blanchard, who looks at Sergeant Dubois, who shrugs with the resignation of someone who's stopped expecting military operations to achieve their stated objectives. "We didn't lose," Dubois finally says, which is technically accurate but sets a pretty low standard for military success. February brings the arrival of new recruits to replace soldiers who've been killed, wounded, or evacuated for medical reasons that range from trench foot to nervous exhaustion. The new soldiers are 18 and 19 years old, fresh from training camps where they learned military theory but not trench reality. Private Lecomte, who's assigned to your section, arrives with clean equipment, optimistic attitudes, and questions that demonstrate the gap between training and actual combat experience. "When do we attack the German trenches?" he asks during his first day, while examining no man's land through a periscope and apparently expecting to see something other than mud, wire, and scattered equipment from previous unsuccessful attacks. Marcel, who's been in the trenches for 6 months and has developed the philosophical outlook of someone who's survived longer than statistical probability suggested, answers with the patience of a teacher explaining basic concepts to particularly slow students. "We attack the German trenches when someone with more authority than sense decides that sending people to run toward machine guns will solve political problems," Marcel explains. "This happens approximately once a month, depending on how many replacement soldiers are available and how optimistic the officers are feeling." Lecomte considers this information while watching German soldiers in their trenches doing exactly the same things French soldiers do, which is mainly trying to stay alive while waiting for orders that will probably make staying alive more difficult. "What do we do the rest of the time?" Lecomte asks, which is a reasonable question about daily routine in an environment designed around periodic attempts at mutual destruction. "We dig holes, clean equipment, watch for German attacks, and try not to die of disease, exposure, or accidents," you explain, while cleaning your rifle for the 3rd time today, because mud and moisture are more persistent than German advances. "That doesn't sound very exciting," Lecomte observes, which demonstrates that military recruitment materials might not provide complete information about trench warfare entertainment value. "Exciting is when people shoot at you," Marcel replies. "Boring is when people aren't shooting at you." You'll learn to prefer boring. This conversation is interrupted by the arrival of mail, which is delivered by soldiers whose job involves carrying letters through conditions that would challenge postal services with better equipment and fewer people shooting at them. Mail delivery in the trenches is irregular, depending on weather, transportation, and the current enthusiasm of German artillery for disrupting French communication lines. You receive a letter from your mother, written 3 weeks ago and filtered through military censorship that removes any information considered harmful to morale or useful to enemy intelligence. The censored version reads like a conversation between people who are only allowed to discuss weather and farming, which makes it difficult to determine what's actually happening at home. Dear Henry, the letter begins, I hope you are well and staying warm. The weather here has been cold, and we had snow last week. Your father is working on the roof again because the wind knocked some tiles loose. We received your last letter and were happy to hear that you are safe. The letter continues for 2 paragraphs without mentioning anything specific about home, your family's health, local events, or anything else that might provide useful information about the world outside the trenches. Military censorship has reduced your mother's news to generic statements that could apply to anyone, anywhere, at any time. Marcel receives a letter from his girlfriend, which has been similarly edited to remove content that military censors consider sensitive. After reading it, he looks confused and slightly disappointed. What did she say? You ask, though you suspect the answer will be similarly generic. She says she misses me and hopes I'm staying safe. Marcel replies. Then there are several paragraphs that have been completely blacked out, so I have no idea what she was actually trying to tell me. You wonder what information could be dangerous enough to require censorship in letters from girlfriends, but military security policies don't typically explain their reasoning to people whose job is getting shot at rather than making decisions about information management. Private Lecomte, who hasn't received any mail because he's been in the trenches for less than a week, asks about the letter-writing process with the curiosity of someone who's never tried to communicate through military censorship systems. What happens if you write something they don't want you to write? He asks, which is a practical question about correspondence policies in wartime. They black it out with ink, Dubois explains. Or they don't send your letter at all, depending on how sensitive they think your information is. What kind of information is sensitive? Lecomte continues, apparently trying to understand the boundaries of acceptable military correspondence. Dubois thinks about this while examining a letter he's writing to his wife, checking for content that might attract censorship attention. Anything about casualties, unit locations, military operations, equipment problems, food problems, medical problems, or opinions about military leadership, he says. Basically, anything interesting. You realize that your letters home have been reduced to discussing weather, expressing generic concern for family welfare, and requesting packages of food or supplies that probably won't arrive due to transportation difficulties. This makes correspondence feel like participating in a conversation where you're only allowed to discuss topics that don't matter to anyone involved. March brings the spring offensive, which is military terminology for when winter weather improves enough that large-scale attacks become possible again. The offensive is planned by General Nivelle, who's convinced that French forces can break through German lines using tactics that haven't worked yet but might work now if applied with sufficient enthusiasm and casualties. The pre-offensive preparations involve artillery bombardments that last for days, designed to destroy German defences and demoralize German soldiers before French infantry attacks. The bombardment is so intense that it can be heard from 50 kilometers away, which means everyone in northern France knows that something significant is about to happen, including German soldiers, who are presumably making their own preparations for French enthusiasm. Your section receives new equipment for the offensive, including gas masks that are supposed to protect you from chemical weapons, steel helmets that might stop shrapnel, and extra ammunition for rifles that still jam when they get dirty, which happens immediately and constantly in trench conditions. The gas masks are particularly interesting pieces of equipment, consisting of rubber face pieces connected to filter canisters that supposedly neutralize poison gas before it reaches your lungs. The masks are uncomfortable, reduce visibility, make breathing difficult, and fog up whenever you exhale, which is constantly. Wearing them feels like trying to breathe through a wet cloth while looking through dirty windows, but the alternative is dying from poison gas, which seems worse. Private Lecomte tries on his gas mask and immediately starts making muffled complaints about how difficult it is to see, breathe, and communicate while wearing protective equipment designed by people who apparently never had to use it in actual combat conditions. "How are we supposed to fight while wearing these?" he asks, though his voice is distorted by the mask until it sounds like someone talking through a tin can filled with cotton. Marcel, who's been experimenting with his own mask, demonstrates the communication difficulties by trying to give orders that nobody can understand. "I think I said fix bayonets, but it might have been fix bananas, or possibly something about fixing kitchen utensils," he reports after removing his mask to clarify his previous instructions. You practice putting on your gas mask quickly, which is a skill that becomes important when German artillery starts including poison gas shells in their bombardments. The process involves recognizing the gas alarm, which is someone hitting a metal shell casing with a hammer to create noise that supposedly sounds different from other battlefield noise, then putting on your mask before inhaling chemicals that will kill you. Gas mask drills reveal that you can go from normal breathing to protected breathing in about 30 seconds if you're prepared and not being shot at. This increases to several minutes if you're surprised, confused, or trying to help other people with their masks while dealing with equipment that doesn't work properly under stress. Corporal Blanchard, who's been trained in treating gas casualties, explains the medical effects of poison gas with the cheerful demeanor of someone teaching a cooking class, rather than discussing chemical weapons designed to cause maximum suffering. "Chlorine gas burns your lungs and throat," he explains, while demonstrating proper gas mask maintenance techniques. "Mustard gas burns your skin and causes blisters that take weeks to heal. Phosgene gas damages your lungs gradually, so you might feel fine for hours before drowning in your own body fluids." This information is educational but not particularly comforting, especially since gas mask effectiveness depends on proper fit, functioning filters, and remembering to put them on before breathing poison rather than after. "What happens if your mask doesn't work?" Lecomte asks, which is a practical question about equipment failure during chemical attacks. "You die badly," Blanchard replies, with the medical honesty that comes from treating gas casualties and seeing exactly what poison gas does to human respiratory systems. The offensive begins on April 16th, with an artillery barrage that makes previous bombardments seem like practice sessions. The shells fall on German positions for 18 hours, creating noise that drowns out conversation and shaking the ground hard enough to knock equipment off shelves and cause structural damage to trenches that are supposed to be stable. You huddle in your dugout, while French artillery systematically destroys everything within several kilometers of German trenches, including trees, buildings, roads, and presumably some German soldiers who didn't find adequate shelter. The bombardment is so intense that you begin to wonder if there will be anything left to attack when the infantry assault begins. Marcel, who's sharing your dugout along with 4 other soldiers, tries to sleep through the artillery noise, but gives up after several hours of attempting to rest while the world explodes outside. "Do you think this is working?" he asks, gesturing toward the dugout entrance where flashes of light indicate that explosives are being converted into noise and destruction at regular intervals. "It's definitely loud," you reply, which is accurate but doesn't address whether volume equals military effectiveness. Sergeant Dubois, who's been trying to maintain equipment while everything shakes constantly, looks up from cleaning his rifle and says, "The theory is that we're destroying German defenses so thoroughly that they won't be able to resist our attack." "What if the theory is wrong?" Lecomte asks, which demonstrates that he's learning to ask practical questions about military planning. "Then we'll find out tomorrow when we attack positions that might still be defended by people who are angry about being shelled for 18 hours. Dubois replies, with the philosophical resignation of someone who implements plans rather than making them. The artillery barrage stops at exactly 11 o'clock on April 17th, creating a silence that feels almost as disturbing as the previous noise. You emerge from your dugout into a trench that's been significantly modified by the vibrations from nearby explosions, with walls that have shifted, floors that have cracked, and equipment that's been relocated by forces beyond human control. The landscape beyond your trench has been transformed into something that looks like the surface of a hostile planet. Shell craters overlap each other in patterns that suggest mathematical precision applied to destruction. Trees have been reduced to broken stumps that stick up from churned earth like wooden tombstones. Buildings that existed yesterday have become piles of broken stone and timber, scattered across terrain that no longer resembles anything designed for human habitation. "Jesus," Marcel whispers, looking out at no man's land through a periscope that somehow survived the bombardment. "There's nothing left." You take your turn looking through the periscope and see that Marcel's assessment is accurate. The area between French and German trenches has been churned into a moonscape that would challenge lunar rovers, let alone infantry soldiers carrying heavy equipment. German trenches, which were clearly visible yesterday as organized defensive positions, have disappeared under layers of dirt, debris, and smoke that still rises from recent explosions. Either the German soldiers have been buried under their own fortifications, or they've retreated to positions that weren't targeted by French artillery, or they're hiding in underground bunkers, waiting for French soldiers to advance across impossible terrain. Captain Rousseau appears in your trench section, carrying orders and wearing the expression of someone who's about to deliver news that will significantly affect your life expectancy. "Gentlemen," he announces, "the barrage has been successful beyond expectations. German resistance has been eliminated and will be advancing to occupy their former positions." You look again at the lunar landscape that separates your trench from whatever remains of German trenches, then look at Captain Rousseau, who apparently interprets destruction as military success rather than evidence that the terrain is now impassable. "Sir," Marcel says with the careful respect required when questioning superior officers, "how do we advance across that?" Captain Rousseau follows Marcel's gesture toward no man's land and studies the cratered wasteland with the expression of someone seeing it clearly for the first time. "Carefully," he finally replies, which is tactical advice roughly equivalent to suggesting that soldiers should try not to get killed while doing things that are likely to get them killed. The attack begins at dawn on April 18th, with your unit climbing out of trenches into terrain that would challenge mountain climbers equipped with specialized gear rather than infantry soldiers carrying rifles and heavy packs. The shell craters are filled with water that's turned the consistency of soup, mixed with mud, debris, and materials you prefer not to identify. Walking across the battlefield requires jumping from crater rim to crater rim, avoiding water-filled holes that ankle deep or deep enough to drown in, while carrying equipment that becomes heavier with every step as mud accumulates on your boots and clothing. Private Lecomte, who's participating in his first major offensive, falls into a crater filled with water and mud within the first 50 meters of the advance. He emerges looking like someone who's been dipped in chocolate, except the chocolate smells like explosives and human waste. "I'm stuck," he announces, while trying to climb out of the crater with boots that now weigh approximately twice what they weighed when he left the trench. You and Marcel help pull him out of the crater, a process that requires all three of you working together and results in everyone being covered with mud that has the consistency of wet cement and approximately the same drying properties. The advance continues at a pace that would embarrass snails, across terrain that becomes more difficult with every meter, as accumulated mud makes movement increasingly challenging. Your rifle, which was clean when you started the attack, now has mud in the barrel, mud in the action, and mud covering the sights, making it approximately as useful as a very expensive club. After 2 hours of struggling across 400 meters of lunar landscape, you reach what used to be German trenches and discover that they're currently occupied by German soldiers who apparently weren't eliminated by the artillery barrage. This comes as a surprise to Captain Rousseau, who planned the attack based on reports that German resistance had been destroyed. The German soldiers begin shooting at you from positions that are difficult to locate because they're hidden in bomb-proof bunkers that survived 18 hours of artillery bombardment. Their machine guns work perfectly despite the recent explosive remodeling of the landscape, which suggests that German engineering standards might exceed French artillery effectiveness. Marcel, who's advancing next to you when the German shooting starts, dives into the nearest shell crater and lands in water that's cold enough to make him gasp and deep enough to require swimming motions to keep his head above the surface. "This isn't working," he shouts, while trying to find footing in a crater that appears to be deeper than expected and filled with water that might be connected to underground drainage systems. You dive into the same crater, which turns out to be an excellent decision because German machine gun fire immediately begins hitting the ground where you were standing. The water in the crater is cold enough to cause immediate muscle cramps and dirty enough to pose health risks that would concern medical professionals if any were available to express concern. Private Lecomte lands in the crater next to you, followed by two soldiers whose names you don't know but whose expressions suggest they're having similar thoughts about the effectiveness of current military strategy. "What do we do now?" one of them asks, while German bullets hit the rim of your crater with sounds that indicate the shooters are close enough to see individual targets rather than just shooting in your general direction. You look around the crater, which provides excellent protection from German small arms fire, but also serves as a trap that's difficult to escape without exposing yourself to the people who drove you into it in the first place. The water level in the crater reaches your chest, which means you're essentially hiding in a cold, dirty swimming pool while people try to kill you. Marcel, who's been examining the crater walls for escape routes, points toward a section where the rim is lower and might provide concealment for movement toward other craters that are closer to German positions. "We could try to get to that crater over there," he suggests, indicating a shell hole about 20 meters away that might offer better tactical advantages or might just be a different place to get killed. "Or we could stay here until dark and then retreat," Lecomte counters, which demonstrates practical thinking about survival versus military objectives. The decision is made for you when German soldiers begin throwing hand grenades into shell craters, apparently having noticed that French soldiers are using them for protection. The grenades explode with enough force to create new, smaller craters within the existing craters, and produce shrapnel that demonstrates why staying in one place during combat is generally a poor long-term strategy. You climb out of your crater and run toward the next one, followed by Marcel, Lecomte, and the two unnamed soldiers who've apparently decided that movement under fire is preferable to staying in place under fire and explosives. This decision proves partially correct, as you successfully reach the next crater without getting shot, but also proves partially incorrect, as the next crater contains water that's deeper and colder than the previous crater. The second crater also contains a dead German soldier who's been there long enough to demonstrate what happens to human bodies when they're exposed to artillery bombardments and weather conditions simultaneously. The body is educational but not particularly pleasant to share swimming space with, especially since the water level requires you to maintain close personal proximity to someone who's no longer participating in conversations. "This is disgusting," Lecomte observes, while trying to position himself in the crater in a way that minimizes contact with the deceased German while maintaining protection from live Germans who are still shooting. "Dead people are less dangerous than live people with machine guns," Marcel replies, which is philosophical but accurate under current circumstances. You spend the next 4 hours moving from crater to crater, occasionally shooting at German positions you can't see clearly. While German soldiers occasionally shoot back at French positions they probably can't see clearly either. This continues until ammunition runs low, casualties mount, and someone with more authority than field experience decides that the attack has achieved its objectives, or at least provided sufficient educational value about the relationship between artillery effectiveness and infantry reality. The retreat back to French trenches happens under cover of darkness, which makes it safer but significantly more confusing, as navigation in a cratered landscape becomes nearly impossible without visible landmarks. You carry Private Lecomte, who caught a piece of shrapnel in his leg and can no longer walk effectively, while Marcel helps carry one of the unnamed soldiers who turned out to be named Beaumont and is currently bleeding from wounds that require medical attention beyond field first aid capabilities. By the time you reach your own trenches, the offensive has been officially classified as a limited success, which is military terminology for situations where casualties exceeded gains, but some progress was made toward objectives that might have been achieved more efficiently through different methods. Your unit started the attack with 42 men and returned with 31, representing an 11-person lesson in the mathematical relationship between optimistic planning and battlefield reality. The German trenches that were supposed to be captured are still occupied by German soldiers, who apparently weren't as demoralized by artillery bombardments as military planning had assumed. Corporal Blanchard, who's been waiting with medical supplies and the expression of someone who expected casualties, begins treating wounded soldiers while explaining the mathematical principles of military medicine under resource constraints. "I have enough supplies to treat serious wounds on 20 people," he explains, while examining injuries that range from minor shrapnel cuts to damage that requires immediate surgery. "If more than 20 people need serious treatment, we'll have to make decisions about priorities." This information is educational, but highlights the gap between medical needs and medical resources in combat zones where supply lines are complicated by people shooting at transportation vehicles. Private Beaumont, who's bleeding from shrapnel wounds in his shoulder and arm, asks the question that summarizes everyone's current thinking about military strategy and personal survival. "When does this end?" he asks, while Blanchard cleans wounds that are dirty enough to require extensive irrigation before proper medical treatment. Blanchard looks up from his work and considers the question with the expression of someone who's been asked to predict the behavior of political leaders based on medical training and combat experience. "When one side runs out of people or money," he finally replies, "or when the politicians decide that continuing costs more than stopping." You think about this while watching soldiers who've been wounded in an attack that didn't achieve its stated objectives, carried out by people who are following orders, created by people who don't have to implement them personally. The mathematical relationship between political decisions and personal consequences seems disconnected in ways that would be interesting if they weren't currently affecting your life expectancy. Marcel, who's been unusually quiet since returning from the offensive, suddenly speaks up with the kind of observation that comes from someone who spent too much time thinking about mortality while hiding in shell craters. "You know what I realized today?" he says, while cleaning mud off equipment that will be dirty again tomorrow. "This war isn't about winning or losing anymore. It's about proving that we're willing to keep losing people until the other side gets tired of losing people too." This observation captures something important about the current military situation, though it's not the kind of insight that military leadership probably wants soldiers to reach independently. May brings new orders, more training, and replacement soldiers to fill the gaps left by the April offensive. The replacement soldiers are younger than previous recruits, some of them 17 years old and freshly removed from farms and factories where their previous experience with violence was limited to slaughtering livestock and arguing with machinery. Private Dubois, not the sergeant, just another coincidence of surnames, arrives with enthusiasm that suggests military recruitment materials are still emphasizing adventure and patriotism rather than mud, disease, and mathematical probability of injury or death. "When do we get to fight the Germans?" he asks during his first day, while examining his rifle with the excitement of someone who's never had to clean human blood off military equipment. Marcel, who's been in the trenches for 8 months and has developed the philosophical outlook of someone who's survived longer than optimistic predictions suggested, answers with the patience of a teacher explaining advanced concepts to elementary students. "We fight the Germans when officers decide that not enough people have been killed recently," Marcel explains. "This happens regularly, depending on weather conditions, supply availability, and how confident the generals are feeling about their strategies." Young Dubois considers this information while watching German soldiers in their trenches, who are probably having similar conversations about fighting French soldiers when their officers decide similar things about casualty rates and strategic confidence. What do the Germans think about this war? Dubois asks, which is a reasonable question about enemy psychology that nobody seems equipped to answer authoritatively. Probably the same things we think about it, you reply, while cleaning your rifle and reflecting on the universal nature of being cold, tired, and confused about political decisions that require teenagers to shoot each other. Which is what? Dubois continues, apparently trying to understand the philosophical framework of modern warfare. Marcel stops cleaning his equipment and looks toward the German trenches, where enemy soldiers are doing exactly the same maintenance activities that French soldiers do, probably complaining about the same problems in a different language. That this is stupid, but we're here anyway, Marcel finally says, which summarizes the existential situation of most combat soldiers who didn't choose their political circumstances but are required to implement them personally. This conversation is interrupted by the arrival of mail, which includes a letter for you from your mother and a package from Marcel's girlfriend that somehow survived military censorship and transportation through combat zones. Your mother's letter, written in April and filtered through censorship systems that remove interesting content, provides updates on village life that seem disconnected from your current reality of mud, explosives, and interpersonal violence. Dear Henry, the letter begins, I hope this finds you well and safe. Spring has come early this year, and the flowers are blooming beautifully. Your father has been working in the fields, preparing for planting season. We think of you often and pray for your safe return. The letter continues with information about neighbors, weather, and agricultural activities that belong to a world where people's primary concerns involve growing food rather than avoiding death. Reading about normal life while sitting in a trench designed for killing people creates a psychological disconnect that makes both realities seem equally unreal. Marcel's package contains food, socks, and a photograph of his girlfriend wearing a dress that demonstrates how much effort she put into looking attractive for a picture that will be viewed primarily by soldiers who haven't seen women in months. She's beautiful, Dubois observes, while examining the photograph with the appreciation of someone whose social life has been reduced to conversations with muddy men about military equipment and survival strategies. She was beautiful, Marcel corrects, while carefully placing the photograph in his equipment where it won't get wet or damaged. This picture was taken 6 months ago. By now she might be married to someone who didn't go to war, or dead from influenza, or working in a munitions factory and too tired to write letters. This observation highlights the temporal disconnect between trench reality and home reality, where people continue living normal lives while soldiers live abnormal lives in environments specifically designed to prevent normal living. Young Dubois, who's been listening to this conversation with the expression of someone learning that war involves more complexity than recruitment materials suggested, asks about the relationship between military service and civilian life in ways that demonstrate sophisticated thinking about social systems under stress. Do you think people at home understand what we're doing here? He asks, while watching daily trench activities that mostly involve maintenance, waiting, and trying not to get killed accidentally. They understand what newspapers tell them we're doing here, you reply, while considering the gap between newspaper descriptions of glorious military service and actual military service that involves mainly discomfort, punctuated by moments of terror. What do newspapers say we're doing? Dubois continues, apparently trying to understand how military reality gets translated into civilian information. Marcel, who received a newspaper clipping in his girlfriend's package, unfolds it and reads headlines that describe military activities in language that doesn't match anyone's personal experience of those same activities. Heroic French soldiers advance courageously against German positions. Marcel reads, then looks around at the trench environment where heroism mainly consists of not dying from preventable diseases. Our brave troops maintain high morale despite enemy resistance. You consider the relationship between newspaper descriptions and actual military service, where morale varies depending on food quality, weather conditions, and how recently people have been shot at by strangers for political reasons. June brings the summer offensive, which is planned by different generals using strategies that haven't worked previously, but might work now if applied with greater intensity and more soldiers. The offensive is designed to break through German lines using concentrated attacks that will overwhelm enemy defenses through superior numbers and sustained pressure. Your unit receives new equipment for the offensive, including rifles that jam slightly less frequently than previous rifles, helmets that might stop smaller pieces of shrapnel, and gas masks that have been improved to the point where you can almost breathe normally while wearing them. The pre-offensive briefing takes place in a dugout that's been reinforced with timber, sandbags, and optimism about structural engineering in environments where large explosions happen regularly. Major Pétain, who's replaced Captain Rousseau after his unfortunate encounter with German artillery during the May operations, explains the offensive strategy with confidence that suggests either superior military education or insufficient personal experience with previous offensive strategies. Gentlemen, Major Pétain begins, unfolding maps that show clear objectives and logical progression routes, but don't indicate actual terrain conditions or German defensive preparations. This offensive will succeed where previous efforts have encountered difficulties. Sergeant Dubois, who's attended enough military briefings to recognize the difference between planning theory and implementation reality, raises his hand with the expression of someone asking practical questions about impractical orders. Sir, what makes this offensive different from the previous offensives? Dubois asks, which is a reasonable question about military innovation and learning from experience. Major Pétain studies his maps with the concentration of someone who genuinely believes that drawing lines on paper translates directly into successful battlefield outcomes. Superior planning, he replies, and better coordination between artillery, infantry, and command elements. You consider this explanation while reflecting on previous offensives that were also described as featuring superior planning and better coordination, but resulted mainly in demonstrating the mathematical relationship between optimistic planning and resistant reality. Marcel, who's been examining his rifle and thinking about equipment reliability under combat stress, asks about practical implementation details that might affect personal survival probability. Sir, what about German defensive improvements since the last offensive? Marcel asks, which demonstrates tactical thinking about enemy adaptation and learning curves. Major Pétain consults additional maps that apparently contain information about German military activities, though you're uncertain how that information was obtained given that German soldiers don't typically share their defensive plans with French intelligence services. Intelligence reports indicate that German morale is declining, Pétain replies, and their defensive capabilities have been degraded by sustained French pressure. This information sounds encouraging, but you notice that intelligence reports about enemy morale are difficult to verify without conducting surveys among German soldiers, which seems logistically challenging given current diplomatic relations. The offensive begins on June 27th with an artillery barrage that demonstrates French commitment to solving military problems through applications of controlled explosives. The bombardment lasts for 6 hours and creates noise that can be heard in Paris, which is probably not intentional, but demonstrates the volume levels achieved when large quantities of explosives are detonated in rapid succession. You huddle in your dugout while French artillery systematically destroys everything within several kilometers of your position, including some French positions that apparently weren't clearly marked on artillery maps. The friendly fire incidents are educational but highlight coordination challenges in military operations that involve multiple units shooting explosives in approximately the same direction. Young Dubois, who's experiencing his first major artillery barrage, sits in the corner of the dugout with his hands over his ears, and the expression of someone discovering that war is significantly louder than he expected. "How long does this last?" he shouts over the artillery noise, though his voice is barely audible above explosions that shake dirt from the dugout ceiling onto everyone's equipment. Marcel, who's been through enough artillery barrages to develop coping strategies, has given up trying to maintain clean equipment and is instead focusing on not being buried alive when structural supports fail under sustained vibration. "Till they run out of shells or targets," Marcel shouts back, "whichever comes first." The barrage stops at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, creating silence that feels artificial after 6 hours of continuous explosions. You emerge from your dugout into a trench that's been modified by nearby shell impacts, with walls that have shifted and equipment that's been redistributed by forces beyond human control. The landscape beyond your trench has been transformed into terrain that would challenge geological survey teams equipped with specialized instruments. Shell craters overlap in patterns that suggest mathematical precision applied to landscape modification. Trees have been converted into wooden debris, scattered across areas that no longer resemble their original topography. Major Petain appears in your trench section carrying orders and wearing the expression of someone who's about to implement plans that seemed reasonable when developed in locations where people weren't shooting. "Gentlemen," he announces, "the barrage has achieved complete success. German defensive positions have been eliminated and will be advancing to secure their former territory." You look toward German lines, which are currently obscured by smoke and dust from recent explosions, making it difficult to assess whether German defensive positions have been eliminated or just temporarily concealed. Marcel, who's been studying the terrain through a periscope, points toward areas where German trenches were visible yesterday and are now covered with debris that might conceal defensive positions or might indicate complete destruction. "Sir," Marcel says with careful military courtesy, "how do we know the German positions have been eliminated?" Major Petain consults his pocket watch and refers to written orders that apparently contain information about German defensive capabilities based on artillery effectiveness calculations. The bombardment was calculated to destroy all defensive structures in the target area. Petain explains, and aerial reconnaissance confirms significant damage to enemy positions. This information sounds scientific, but you notice that aerial reconnaissance might not detect German soldiers hiding in underground bunkers that were specifically designed to survive artillery bombardments. The attack begins at 2 o'clock, with your unit climbing out of trenches into terrain that demonstrates what happens when explosives are applied systematically to landscape modification. The ground is soft from recent excavation and mixed with debris that includes metal fragments, broken equipment, and materials you prefer not to identify specifically. Walking across the battlefield requires careful navigation around shell craters that are filled with water, mud, and obstacles that complicate movement for soldiers carrying heavy equipment. Your rifle becomes dirty within the first 50 meters of advance, acquiring mud that affects mechanical function and accuracy. Private Dubois, who's participating in his first infantry assault, follows behind you with the concentration of someone trying to learn combat techniques through observation and practice. He carries his rifle carefully and watches for German defensive positions that might have survived the artillery preparation. "Where are the German soldiers?" Dubois asks, while advancing across terrain where German trenches should be visible but are currently obscured by smoke and debris. "Either dead, hiding, or retreated to secondary positions," you reply, while trying to identify landmarks that would indicate your location relative to German defensive lines. Marcel, who's advancing to your left, suddenly stops and points toward a section of disturbed ground where something is moving among the debris. The movement turns out to be German soldiers emerging from underground bunkers that survived 6 hours of artillery bombardment. "Contact front," Marcel shouts, which is military terminology for situations where enemy soldiers are discovered in locations where they weren't expected to be. The German soldiers begin shooting at your advancing unit with rifles and machine guns that work perfectly despite recent explosive modification of their operating environment. Their weapons are clean, their aim is accurate, and their tactical positions provide excellent fields of fire across terrain that offers minimal cover for advancing infantry. You dive behind a shell crater rim and discover that protection from German small arms fire requires staying low while the people shooting at you maintain elevated positions that provide tactical advantages. The crater provides cover but also limits your ability to see German positions or return effective fire. Dubois lands in the same crater, followed by Marcel and 2 replacement soldiers whose names you haven't learned but whose expressions suggest they're having educational experiences about the relationship between artillery preparation and infantry reality. "This isn't working," Dubois observes, while German bullets hit the crater rim with sounds that indicate the shooters are close enough to see individual targets. "Nothing ever works," Marcel replies, while trying to identify German firing positions through gaps in the crater rim. "The trick is surviving long enough to try something else." You spend the next 3 hours moving from crater to crater, occasionally shooting at German positions that are difficult to locate precisely, while German soldiers return fire from defensive positions that weren't eliminated by artillery bombardment. The advance progresses slowly across difficult terrain toward objectives that become less achievable with each hour as casualties mount and ammunition decreases. Private Dubois, who's been learning combat techniques through practical application, gets hit by shrapnel from a German hand grenade and requires immediate medical attention that exceeds field first aid capabilities. "I can't feel my leg," Dubois reports, while examining wounds that suggest German explosive devices are effective at damaging human tissue. You examine his injuries and discover that shrapnel has caused damage that requires professional medical treatment rather than battlefield improvisation. The wounds are bleeding enough to require pressure bandages and evacuation to aid stations equipped with surgical supplies. Marcel helps you carry Dubois toward the aid station, which requires moving across terrain under fire while supporting someone who can't walk effectively. The process is complicated by German soldiers who continue shooting at French soldiers, apparently unaware that some of those soldiers are trying to provide medical assistance rather than military threats. The retreat to French lines happens under covering fire from soldiers who remain in advanced positions, shooting at German defensive positions to discourage German soldiers from shooting at French soldiers who are carrying wounded personnel across difficult terrain. By the time you reach your own trenches, the offensive has been classified as a partial success, which is military terminology for situations where some objectives were achieved at costs that exceeded initial estimates. Your unit advanced approximately 200 meters, captured several shell craters, and learned important lessons about the relationship between artillery effectiveness and German defensive engineering. Your original unit of 42 men now consists of 28 soldiers, representing a 14-person educational experience about combat mathematics and military planning assumptions. The German defensive positions that were supposed to be eliminated are still occupied by German soldiers who apparently weren't sufficiently demoralized by French artillery to abandon their military responsibilities. Corporal Blanchard, who's been treating wounded soldiers for 6 months and has developed efficient triage procedures for situations where medical needs exceed medical resources, examines Dubois' wounds while explaining battlefield medicine under resource constraints. The shrapnel missed major blood vessels, Blanchard explains, while cleaning wounds that require irrigation before proper medical treatment. He'll need surgery, but he should recover if infection doesn't develop. This information is encouraging but highlights the conditional nature of medical predictions in environments where antiseptic supplies are limited and wounded soldiers must wait for transportation to facilities equipped for complex medical procedures. Dubois, who's conscious but pale from blood loss and shock, asks the question that summarizes most soldiers' thinking about military service and personal survival prospects. "How long before I can go home?" he asks, while Blanchard applies bandages designed to control bleeding during transportation to medical facilities. Blanchard considers this question while working with medical supplies that were designed for treating smaller numbers of less severely wounded patients. "Medical discharge takes time," Blanchard explains, "and depends on recovery progress and administrative processing. Could be weeks or months." You think about this while watching soldiers who've been wounded implementing military strategies that didn't achieve their stated objectives, carried out by people following orders created by people who won't personally experience the implementation consequences. July brings reorganization, replacement soldiers, and new strategic plans developed by military leadership that apparently believes previous strategies would have succeeded with better execution rather than different approaches. The replacement soldiers are increasingly young, some of them 16 years old and removed from civilian life, before they could develop practical skills that might be useful in military environments. Private Lambert arrives with enthusiasm that suggests military recruitment has become less selective about age requirements and more optimistic about training timelines. He's 16 years old, weighs maybe 50 kilograms, and asks questions that demonstrate the gap between civilian expectations and military reality. "When do we charge the German trenches?" Lambert asks during his first day, while examining equipment that's larger than he is, and apparently expecting immediate opportunities for heroic action. Marcel, who's been in the trenches for 10 months and has developed teaching skills through necessity, explains modern warfare concepts to someone who clearly learned military strategy from adventure novels rather than practical experience. "We charge German trenches when officers decide that current casualty rates are insufficient," Marcel explains, while demonstrating proper rifle maintenance techniques. This happens regularly, but charging is just one part of a longer process that includes getting shot at, hiding in holes, and carrying wounded people back to medical facilities. Lambert considers this information while watching daily trench activities that mostly involve maintenance, guard duty, and trying to prevent equipment from deteriorating in hostile environmental conditions. "What do we do when we're not charging?" Lambert asks, which demonstrates practical thinking about time management in military environments. "We dig holes, clean equipment, watch for German attacks, and try not to die from diseases that spread quickly when large numbers of people live in close proximity without adequate sanitation facilities," you explain, while cleaning your rifle for the 4th time today. This conversation is interrupted by the arrival of German artillery shells, which begin falling on French positions with accuracy that suggests German artillery observers have been watching French trench activities and making notes about target locations. The bombardment lasts for 2 hours and demonstrates German commitment to disrupting French military activities through applications of explosive devices delivered at high velocity. You huddle in your dugout while shells explode close enough to shake equipment and far enough away to avoid immediate structural collapse. Lambert, who's experiencing his first enemy artillery barrage, crouches in the corner of the dugout with the expression of someone discovering that war involves people actively trying to kill him rather than just theoretical danger. "Are they shooting at us specifically?" Lambert asks, while shell explosions create noise levels that make conversation difficult and thinking nearly impossible. "They're shooting at French soldiers generally," Marcel replies. "But since we're French soldiers in a location where French soldiers are supposed to be, yes, they're shooting at us specifically." A shell explodes close enough to collapse part of the trench wall and bury some equipment under debris that will take hours to excavate. The explosion creates a crater that's deep enough to hide in and close enough to throw dirt into your dugout through the entrance. "Someone should repair that," Lambert observes, pointing toward the collapsed trench section where sandbags and wooden supports have been redistributed by explosive forces. "Someone will repair it when the shelling stops," you reply, because repairing things while people are shooting at you is generally counterproductive. The bombardment stops at sunset, creating silence that allows you to hear sounds that were previously masked by explosions. These sounds include someone screaming for medical assistance, someone calling for help digging out buried equipment, and someone praying in Latin with increasing desperation. You emerge from your dugout into a trench that's been significantly remodeled by German artillery, with walls that have shifted, floors that have cracked, and drainage systems that no longer function properly. Water accumulates in areas where it didn't accumulate before, creating new swamp conditions in sections that were previously merely muddy. Marcel begins organizing repair work with the efficiency of someone who's learned that military infrastructure requires constant maintenance under conditions specifically designed to prevent effective maintenance. "Lambert, you help dig out the buried equipment," Marcel instructs while examining structural damage that exceeds immediate repair capabilities. "Henri, you help with the wounded. I'll work on the wall repairs." This division of labor makes sense, given available personnel and urgent repair requirements, though you notice that all the tasks involve working in areas where German artillery has demonstrated the ability to hit targets accurately. Private Lambert begins digging through debris that contains equipment, personal belongings, and materials that were probably important before they got buried under several tons of displaced earth. The digging process is complicated by the fact that some of the buried items are no longer in their original condition. "I found someone's rifle," Lambert reports, while excavating equipment that's been compressed by explosive forces into shapes that rifles don't typically achieve. "Can it still shoot?" Marcel asks, while rebuilding sandbag walls with materials that were recently redistributed by German engineering. Lambert examines the rifle, which has been bent into a configuration that suggests advanced metalworking techniques applied under extreme pressure. "I don't think so," he admits. You help carry wounded soldiers to the aid station, which has been damaged by artillery but is still functioning at reduced capacity. Corporal Blanchard continues treating injured personnel with medical supplies that were designed for smaller numbers of less severely wounded patients. "How many wounded?" Blanchard asks, while preparing medical equipment for triage procedures that prioritize patients based on survival probability rather than injury severity. "7 that I can see," you reply, "plus maybe more buried under the collapsed section." Blanchard nods and begins treating injuries that range from minor cuts to damage that requires immediate surgery. His medical supplies are running low, which means treatment decisions must consider resource allocation as well as patient needs. Private Garnier, who caught shrapnel in his chest during the bombardment, asks about evacuation procedures while Blanchard examines wounds that are bleeding enough to require pressure bandages and immediate transportation. "When can I get to a real hospital?" Garnier asks, while trying not to look at injuries that are visible through gaps in his torn uniform. "Transportation depends on availability of stretcher bearers and vehicles," Blanchard explains, "and current German artillery activity might delay evacuation until conditions improve." This information highlights the relationship between medical needs and tactical situations where wounded soldiers must wait for treatment until it's safe for medical personnel to transport them through areas where German soldiers might be shooting. August brings the Passchendaele offensive, which is planned by British command with French support and designed to achieve breakthrough objectives that previous offensives haven't achieved, using strategies that combine previous tactical elements with new operational approaches. Your unit is assigned to support British forces advancing toward German positions near the village of Passchendaele, which has strategic importance that requires capturing it despite defensive preparations that make capturing it extremely difficult. The pre-offensive briefing takes place in a reinforced dugout that's been equipped with maps, communication equipment, and chairs for officers who need to sit down while explaining plans that will be implemented by people who won't get to sit down. General Haig's representative, a British colonel, whose name you don't catch but whose accent suggests expensive education, explains the offensive strategy with confidence that transcends national boundaries and tactical realities. "Gentlemen," the colonel begins, unfolding maps that show objectives marked with colored pencils and progress routes drawn with optimistic assumptions about resistance levels, "this offensive will succeed through coordinated attacks that overwhelm German defensive capabilities." The maps show clear advancement routes across terrain that appears flat and manageable on paper, but might present different challenges when experienced by soldiers carrying heavy equipment while people shoot at them. Sergeant Dubois, who's attended enough international military briefings to recognize universal patterns in optimistic planning, asks practical questions about coordination between French and British units operating in the same general area. "Sir, what about communication between French and British forces during the attack?" Dubois asks, which demonstrates sophisticated thinking about coordination challenges in multinational military operations. The British colonel consults additional maps that apparently contain information about communication procedures, though you notice that communication under combat conditions might differ from communication during planning meetings. "Radio and runner systems will maintain coordination," the colonel replies, "and liaison officers will ensure proper information flow between command elements." This sounds organized, but you remember that radio equipment often fails under combat conditions, and runner systems depend on people being able to move safely across terrain where other people are shooting. Marcel raises his hand with the expression of someone asking practical questions about impractical orders. "Sir, what about weather conditions?" Marcel asks, while noting that August in Belgium typically involves rain that might affect ground conditions and visibility. The colonel glances toward the dugout entrance, where steady rain has been falling for 3 days and shows no signs of stopping soon. "Weather conditions will provide concealment for advancing forces," the colonel explains, which is military optimism about situations where rain affects both sides equally and usually makes everything more difficult for everyone involved. The offensive begins on July 31st, with an artillery barrage that demonstrates international cooperation in explosive applications. British and French artillery work together to systematically destroy German defensive positions using coordinated targeting that represents impressive logistical achievement in multinational military cooperation. The bombardment lasts for 10 days and creates noise that can be heard across multiple countries, which probably wasn't strategically necessary, but demonstrates the volume levels achieved when large quantities of explosives are detonated by multiple armies simultaneously. You huddle in your dugout while British and French artillery takes turns shooting at German positions, creating a schedule of explosions that would be mathematically interesting if it weren't personally threatening. The sustained bombardment shakes equipment, collapses structural supports, and creates psychological stress that accumulates over time. Lambert, who's been in the trenches for 1 month and is still learning about military life, sits in the corner of the dugout with the expression of someone discovering that international warfare involves significantly more noise than he expected. "Is this normal?" Lambert asks, while explosions outside create vibrations that shake dirt from the ceiling onto everyone's equipment. "This is louder than normal," Marcel replies, "because we're cooperating with British artillery, so we're getting British explosions plus French explosions simultaneously." "Is that good or bad?" Lambert continues, apparently trying to understand whether additional explosive volume represents military advantage or just increased noise levels. "It's louder," you reply, which is factually accurate, but doesn't address tactical effectiveness of multinational artillery cooperation. The bombardment stops on August 10th, creating silence that feels unnatural after 10 days of continuous explosions. You emerge from your dugout into a trench that's been structurally modified by sustained vibration and a landscape that's been geologically remodeled by systematic explosive applications. The terrain beyond your trench has been transformed into something resembling the surface of a planet where geological processes happen quickly and violently. Shell craters overlap in patterns that would be mathematically interesting if they weren't tactically challenging for infantry movement. British soldiers appear in your trench section, carrying equipment that's different from French equipment but serves similar purposes. They speak English with accents that make communication challenging, but their expressions suggest they're having similar thoughts about implementing military plans through personal risk-taking. Sergeant Thompson, a British NCO who's approximately your age but has been in combat longer, explains coordination procedures for the upcoming joint attack, with the practical efficiency of someone who's learned that international cooperation requires clear communication about basic concepts. "Right then," Thompson says, while consulting written orders that have been translated between languages and military systems, "we'll be advancing together toward the German lines. Your lads follow behind our lads, and we'll sort out the details as we go." This plan sounds flexible, which might be diplomatic language for improvised, but seems realistic given the complexity of coordinating multinational military operations under combat conditions. Marcel asks about specific coordination procedures with the curiosity of someone who's participated in enough military operations to appreciate the importance of clear planning. "What happens if we get separated during the advance?" Marcel asks, which demonstrates practical thinking about communication challenges during combat. Thompson considers this question while examining terrain that will be difficult to navigate even under optimal conditions. Signal flares for location identification. Thompson replies, and rally points marked on your maps. If everything goes wrong, just shoot Germans and try to stay alive until someone figures out what to do next. This advice is practical, if not particularly sophisticated, which seems appropriate for situations where complex planning must be implemented under conditions specifically designed to prevent effective planning implementation. The attack begins on August 12th, with British and French units advancing together across terrain that demonstrates what happens when explosive devices are applied systematically to landscape modification for extended periods. You climb out of your trench behind British soldiers, who advance with methodical precision across ground that's soft from recent excavation, and complicated by obstacles that include shell craters, broken equipment, and debris from previous military operations. The rain that's been falling for 2 weeks has turned the battlefield into swamp conditions that would challenge amphibious vehicles, let alone infantry soldiers carrying heavy equipment. Your boots sink into mud that has the consistency of thick soup and approximately the same releasing properties as industrial adhesive. Lambert, who's advancing behind you with the determination of someone trying to prove himself capable of military service, falls into a shell crater that's deeper than expected and filled with water that's deeper than he is tall. "Help!" Lambert calls, while trying to climb out of a crater with walls that are too slippery for effective climbing and water that's too deep for standing. You and a British soldier named Williams help pull Lambert out of the crater, a process that requires all 3 of you working together and results in everyone being covered with mud that smells like explosives mixed with organic decay. "Bloody hell," Williams observes, while examining mud that's accumulated on his equipment in quantities that affect mechanical function. "This is worse than the Somme." You're not familiar with the Somme, but Williams's tone suggests it was an unpleasant military experience that provides context for current conditions. The advance continues at a pace that would embarrass garden snails, across terrain that becomes more challenging with every meter, as accumulated mud makes movement increasingly difficult and German defensive positions become more visible. German machine guns begin firing from positions that weren't eliminated by 10 days of international artillery bombardment, creating crossfire patterns that demonstrate effective defensive planning and construction techniques that survive explosive modification attempts. British soldiers fall down and don't get up. French soldiers fall down and don't get up. And you begin to understand that international cooperation in military operations mainly involves sharing casualty statistics rather than achieving tactical advantages. Thompson, who's been advancing with methodical British precision, dives into a shell crater when German machine gun fire becomes particularly focused on his section of the advance. "This isn't working," Thompson shouts, while German bullets hit the crater rim with accuracy that suggests German gunners can see targets clearly, despite weather conditions that supposedly provide concealment. Marcel, who lands in the same crater, examines German defensive positions through gaps in the crater rim and provides tactical assessment based on practical observation. "They're shooting from concrete bunkers that survived the bombardment," Marcel reports, "and they have clear fields of fire across terrain that doesn't provide cover for advancing infantry." This information is accurate but unhelpful given that retreating across the same terrain exposes you to the same German defensive fire that's currently preventing forward progress. You spend the next 6 hours moving from crater to crater with British and French soldiers, occasionally shooting at German positions that are difficult to locate precisely, while German soldiers return fire from defensive positions that were specifically designed to provide tactical advantages in situations exactly like your current situation. The combined British-French attack achieves approximately 400 meters of territorial gain, at a cost that demonstrates the mathematical relationship between optimistic planning and defensive reality. Your unit starts the day with 32 men and finishes with 24, while British units experience similar casualty ratios that suggest international cooperation in military operations mainly involves sharing educational experiences about combat mathematics. Lambert, who's been learning advanced military techniques through practical application, gets hit by German rifle fire and requires immediate medical attention that exceeds field first aid capabilities. "I think I'm shot," Lambert reports while examining wounds that confirm his diagnosis with medical accuracy. You examine his injuries and discover that German marksmanship has caused damage that requires professional medical treatment rather than battlefield improvisation. The wounds are bleeding enough to require pressure bandages and evacuation to medical facilities equipped with surgical supplies. Williams helps you carry Lambert toward the aid station, which requires moving across terrain under fire while supporting someone who can't walk effectively. The process is complicated by German soldiers who continue shooting at British and French soldiers, apparently unaware that some of those soldiers are providing medical assistance rather than military threats. "How far to the aid station?" Williams asks, while carrying Lambert's equipment in addition to his own and trying to navigate around shell craters that are filled with water deep enough to drown in. "About 200 meters, you reply, while trying to identify landmarks that would indicate your location relative to medical facilities that might have been moved due to German artillery targeting. The evacuation process takes 40 minutes across terrain that would be challenging for unencumbered hikers in good weather, but proves nearly impossible for soldiers carrying wounded personnel while other soldiers shoot at them. By the time you reach the aid station, Lambert has lost consciousness from blood loss and shock, which simplifies transportation but complicates medical assessment of his condition. Corporal Blanchard, who's been treating British and French casualties with medical supplies that were designed for smaller multinational medical emergencies, examines Lambert's wounds while explaining triage procedures under resource constraints. "Bullet went through his shoulder without hitting major blood vessels," Blanchard explains, while cleaning wounds that require irrigation before proper medical treatment. "He'll need surgery, but the prognosis is good if infection doesn't develop." Williams, who's been helping with casualty evacuation and has experience with British military medical procedures, asks about coordination between British and French medical services for wounded soldiers from multinational operations. "Do British and French wounded get treated differently?" Williams asks, which demonstrates practical thinking about medical logistics in international military cooperation. Blanchard considers this question while working with medical supplies that don't distinguish between nationalities when treating traumatic injuries. "Wounded soldiers get treated based on injury severity and survival probability," Blanchard replies, "regardless of which army they belong to. Pain and bleeding are the same in any language." This information highlights one area where international cooperation works effectively, though you notice that medical cooperation might be easier than tactical cooperation because wounded soldiers from different armies have similar needs and don't require complex coordination to achieve shared objectives. September brings news that the war might be ending soon, though this information comes through unofficial channels that include letters from home, conversations with soldiers from other units, and rumors that spread through military communities with speed that exceeds official communication systems. The unofficial information suggests that German military capabilities are declining, civilian populations are experiencing supply shortages, and political leadership in multiple countries is reassessing the costs and benefits of continued military operations. Marcel, who's been in the trenches for 11 months, and has developed philosophical perspectives on military service and political decision-making, shares information he received in a letter from his girlfriend that somehow avoided military censorship. She says people at home are talking about peace negotiations, Marcel reports, while cleaning equipment that he's maintained for nearly a year under conditions specifically designed to prevent effective equipment maintenance. "What kind of peace negotiations?" Lambert asks, who's returned to the trenches after 6 weeks of medical treatment and recovery at a field hospital where he learned about military medicine and surgical procedures. Marcel unfolds his girlfriend's letter and reads sections that weren't censored by military authorities, which mainly contain information about civilian life rather than political developments. She doesn't give specifics, Marcel admits, but she says factory workers are striking, food is getting expensive, and people are tired of reading casualty lists in newspapers. This information suggests that civilian populations are experiencing war fatigue though you're uncertain how civilian war fatigue translates into political decisions about military operations that are currently being implemented by soldiers who don't get consulted about political strategy. Young Lambert, who's been learning about military service through practical experience and medical evacuation, asks questions that demonstrate sophisticated thinking about the relationship between military operations and political outcomes. If the war ends soon, what happens to us? Lambert asks, which is a practical question about demobilization procedures and transition from military service to civilian life. Marcel considers this question while examining equipment that's been maintained under combat conditions for extended periods and might not be suitable for civilian applications. We go home, Marcel replies, assuming we survive long enough for the war to end and there's still a home to go back to. This conversation is interrupted by the arrival of new orders, which include instructions for another offensive operation designed to achieve breakthrough objectives before political negotiations can interfere with military solutions to international disputes. Major Patain, who survived 8 months of combat command and has developed realistic perspectives on military planning and implementation outcomes, explains the new offensive strategy with confidence that seems based more on military necessity than tactical optimism. Gentlemen, Patain begins, consulting maps that show familiar objectives and advancement routes that haven't changed significantly since previous offensive operations. We've been ordered to conduct final operations designed to improve our negotiating position in potential peace discussions. The maps show the same German defensive positions that have been targeted by previous offensives, defended by German soldiers who have presumably learned from previous French attacking techniques and improved their defensive preparations accordingly. Sergeant Dubois, who's implemented enough offensive operations to recognize patterns in military planning that transcend individual tactical situations, asks about the relationship between current military operations and potential political outcomes. Sir, how do military operations affect peace negotiations? Dubois asks, which demonstrates sophisticated thinking about the intersection of tactical success and strategic objectives. Patain considers this question while examining orders that come from political leadership through military command, structures that translate political objectives into tactical operations. Military success provides political leverage, Patain explains, and territorial gains can be exchanged for favorable negotiation terms. This makes political sense, though you notice that military success in current operations has been limited, and territorial gains have been achieved at costs that might exceed their political value. The offensive begins on September 26th, with artillery preparation that demonstrates continued French commitment to solving military problems through systematic explosive applications. The bombardment lasts for 3 days and creates familiar patterns of destruction that have become standard preparation for infantry operations. You huddle in your dugout while French artillery systematically destroys German defensive positions, civilian infrastructure, and landscape features that might provide cover for advancing infantry. The bombardment creates noise that interferes with sleep, vibrations that damage equipment, and psychological stress that accumulates over extended periods. Lambert, who's experiencing his 3rd major artillery preparation since returning from medical evacuation, has developed coping strategies that include accepting that military service involves extended periods of discomfort punctuated by moments of terror. At least we know what to expect this time, Lambert observes, while organizing equipment that will be dirty again within hours of the attack beginning. Expecting terrible things doesn't make them less terrible, Marcel replies, but it makes them less surprising. The attack begins on September 29th with your unit advancing across terrain that's been geologically modified by 3 days of explosive landscape architecture. The ground is soft from recent excavation and mixed with debris that complicates movement for soldiers carrying equipment that gets heavier with accumulated mud. German defensive positions, which were supposed to be eliminated by artillery preparation, turn out to be occupied by German soldiers, who apparently weren't sufficiently demoralized by French explosives to abandon their military responsibilities. The German soldiers begin shooting at advancing French forces with weapons that function effectively despite recent explosive modification of their operating environment. demonstrating German engineering standards and maintenance procedures under adverse conditions. You advance approximately 200 meters across difficult terrain before encountering German resistance that requires taking cover in shell craters and returning fire at targets that are difficult to locate precisely. Marcel, who's advancing to your left, falls into a shell crater that's deeper than expected and filled with water that requires swimming motions to avoid drowning. "The water's too deep," Marcel shouts, while trying to find footing in a crater that appears to be connected to underground drainage systems. You help pull Marcel out of the crater, a process that requires both of you working together and results in both of you being soaked with water that's cold enough to cause immediate muscle cramps and dirty enough to pose health risks. Lambert, who's been advancing with careful attention to terrain conditions, points toward German defensive positions where muzzle flashes indicate active resistance to French territorial objectives. "They're still shooting," Lambert observes, which is accurate, but demonstrates that artillery preparation wasn't as effective as planning assumptions suggested. The attack continues for 5 hours across terrain that becomes more challenging with every meter as casualties mount, ammunition decreases, and German defensive fire becomes more accurate as French soldiers get closer to German positions. Your unit achieves approximately 300 meters of territorial gain before encountering German resistance that exceeds French offensive capabilities. The advance stops when casualties reach levels that prevent effective tactical operations and ammunition supplies become insufficient for sustained combat operations. The retreat to French lines happens under covering fire from soldiers who remain in advanced positions, shooting at German defensive positions to discourage German soldiers from shooting at French soldiers who are carrying wounded personnel across difficult terrain. By the time you reach your own trenches, news arrives that Germany has requested armistice negotiations, which means military operations might stop soon, pending political agreements about terms and conditions for ending hostilities. Your unit has been reduced to 18 soldiers from the original 42 who began military service together, representing a 24-person educational experience about combat mathematics, military planning assumptions, and the relationship between political objectives and personal costs. Marcel, who survived 11 months of combat service against statistical probability predictions, sits in the trench cleaning equipment that he might not need to use again if political negotiations succeed in ending military operations. "Do you think it's really over?" Marcel asks, while examining his rifle that's been maintained under combat conditions for extended periods and might not be necessary for future military service. "Something's over," you reply, while considering the difference between military operations ending and soldiers returning to civilian life, which might involve different timelines and administrative procedures. Lambert, who's been learning about military service through practical experience that included medical evacuation and return to combat duties, asks questions about the transition from military service to civilian life. "What do we do when we go home?" Lambert asks, which is a practical question about skills acquired during military service and their applicability to civilian occupations. Marcel considers this question while examining equipment that's been specialized for military applications and might not be useful for civilian activities. "We try to remember how to live in places where people aren't shooting at us," Marcel replies, "and figure out what to do with everything we've learned about survival, brotherhood, and the distance between political decisions and personal consequences." The armistice is signed on November 11th at 11 o'clock in the morning, creating silence that feels artificial after 4 years of systematic, explosive modification of European geography. The cessation of hostilities is announced through official channels, though soldiers in forward positions continue maintaining defensive preparations till confirmation arrives through multiple communication systems. You sit in your trench at exactly 11 o'clock, listening to silence that contains no artillery fire, no machine gun fire, and no sounds of people trying to kill each other for political reasons that most of the participants never fully understood. The silence is broken by voices of French soldiers, German soldiers, and British soldiers, talking to each other across no man's land without shooting, which creates conversations that have been impossible for 4 years. "Hey, Fritz!" Someone shouts toward German trenches in English that suggests British soldiers are initiating international communication. "Hey, Tommy!" comes a reply in accented English that suggests German soldiers are interested in conversation rather than combat. These conversations lead to soldiers from both sides climbing out of their trenches and meeting in no man's land to exchange cigarettes, food, and photographs while discussing their shared experiences of surviving military service under conditions designed to prevent survival. You climb out of your trench for the first time in daylight without expecting to be shot, which feels unnatural after months of associating surface movement with immediate mortal danger. The sensation of standing upright in daylight without tactical concern is disorienting and requires psychological adjustment that takes several minutes to achieve. Marcel climbs out of the trench next to you, followed by Lambert and the remaining soldiers from your unit, who have survived long enough to experience the end of hostilities. The group walks toward the area between trenches, where soldiers from multiple armies are conducting impromptu international relations without weapons. A German soldier who appears to be approximately your age approaches with the cautious friendliness of someone who's been shooting at people similar to you for extended periods and is now attempting normal social interaction. "Französisch?" the German soldier asks, which demonstrates basic language skills that exceed your German vocabulary. "Oui," Marcel replies, then attempts communication in broken German that suggests his foreign language education was limited. "Deutsch gut?" The German soldier nods and produces a photograph from his uniform pocket, showing a woman and 2 small children who appear to be his family. The photograph is worn from handling and suggests he's been carrying it for extended periods under difficult conditions. You examine the photograph and realize that this German soldier has been shooting at French soldiers while thinking about people he wants to return home to, just like you've been shooting at German soldiers while thinking about your own family and village. Lambert, who's been learning about international relations through practical military experience, asks the German soldier questions using gestures and the few German words he's learned from previous encounters. "Wie alt?" Lambert asks, pointing to the children in the photograph. "Drei und fünf," the German replies, holding up fingers to indicate ages that transcend language barriers. This conversation continues for 20 minutes using a combination of broken languages, gestures, and shared experiences that create communication despite linguistic limitations. The German soldier shares food from his rations, which taste different from French rations but demonstrate similar approaches to military nutrition that prioritize preservation over palatability. Marcel exchanges cigarettes with the German soldier, creating an informal trade relationship that would have been impossible yesterday, but seems natural now that political authorities have decided that military hostilities should end. "What's your name?" Marcel asks in French, then repeats the question using gestures that suggest he's interested in personal identification rather than military intelligence. "Hans," the German soldier replies, then points to Marcel and raises his eyebrows in a universal gesture indicating reciprocal curiosity about personal identification. "Marcel," Marcel responds, then points to you and Lambert to facilitate introductions that create personal connections between people who have been trying to kill each other for political reasons. Hans shakes hands with each of you using formal politeness that suggests he's been raised with social conventions that survived military service and international conflict. His handshake is firm, his expression is friendly, and his uniform is maintained with standards that indicate personal pride, despite extended exposure to conditions specifically designed to prevent effective personal maintenance. The conversation reveals that Hans is from a farming village in Bavaria, has been in military service for 2 years, and has similar experiences with trench warfare, artillery bombardments, and military food that transcend national boundaries and political differences. "Familiar?" Hans asks, while showing his photograph again and gesturing toward you in ways that suggest interest in your own family circumstances. You produce a photograph of your parents that your mother sent 6 months ago, showing them standing in front of your family's cottage, wearing their best clothes and expressions that suggest they were trying to look optimistic for your benefit. Hans examines your family photograph with the attention of someone who understands the importance of family connections during extended separation, then nods approvingly and returns it with care that indicates respect for personal possessions. These interactions continue throughout the afternoon as soldiers from multiple armies discover that their shared experiences of military service create communication possibilities that transcend political differences and linguistic barriers. British soldiers share tea with German soldiers, who share sausages with French soldiers, who share wine with everyone, creating international cooperation that achieves better results than previous military cooperation that involved shooting at each other. Thompson, the British sergeant who participated in joint operations with your unit, approaches the international gathering with curiosity about enemy soldiers who are no longer enemies due to political decisions made by people who weren't personally shooting at anyone. Bloody strange, isn't it? Thompson observes, while watching German soldiers teaching French soldiers card games that apparently translate across cultural boundaries. Yesterday we were trying to kill them. Today we're sharing cigarettes. War is political, Marcel replies. But soldiers are just people who got caught up in political decisions they didn't make. This observation captures something important about the relationship between individual experiences and political systems, though you're uncertain how this understanding translates into future political decision-making or conflict prevention. As evening approaches, soldiers begin returning to their respective trenches, not because hostilities might resume, but because military organization continues to function even when military objectives have been achieved or abandoned. You return to your trench with a different perspective on German soldiers, who turn out to be similar to French soldiers in most ways that matter for daily survival and personal relationships. This understanding makes the previous 4 years seem both more meaningful and more senseless simultaneously. The days following the armistice involve administrative procedures for transitioning from military service to civilian life, which proves more complicated than simply stopping military operations and sending everyone home. Demobilization requires processing paperwork, returning military equipment, receiving medical examinations, and waiting for transportation to become available for moving large numbers of people from military locations to civilian destinations. Your medical examination reveals that 4 years of military service under adverse conditions has affected your health in ways that weren't immediately apparent during combat operations. You've lost 15 kilograms, developed respiratory problems from gas exposure, and acquired scars that will provide permanent reminders of military service. Corporal Blanchard, who's been conducting medical examinations for soldiers preparing to return to civilian life, explains the long-term health effects of military service, with the medical honesty that comes from treating combat injuries for extended periods. Your lungs show damage from gas exposure, Blanchard explains, while examining medical records that document your military health history. You'll probably have breathing problems for the rest of your life, especially in cold weather. This information is concerning but not surprising given that gas mask protection was imperfect and gas attacks were frequent throughout your military service. What about the scars, you ask, while examining wounds that have healed but left permanent marks on your arms and legs? Scars are permanent, Blanchard replies, but they shouldn't affect normal civilian activities. They'll just remind you of experiences that most people won't understand, unless they've had similar experiences. Marcel receives his medical examination results, which indicate similar health effects from extended military service under conditions that weren't designed to promote long-term health and wellness. Malnutrition, respiratory damage, and psychological stress, Marcel reports, while reading medical documentation that summarizes 4 years of physical and mental health challenges. Apparently, military service isn't good for human bodies. Lambert, who's younger and served for less time, receives better medical results that suggest his health problems might be temporary rather than permanent. Minor respiratory irritation and weight loss, Lambert reads from his medical examination report. The doctor says I should recover completely within 6 months if I get proper nutrition and rest. This information highlights the relationship between duration of military service and long-term health consequences, which suggests that surviving military service involves both immediate survival and long-term health management. The transportation home begins in December, with soldiers boarding trains that move slowly across French countryside that shows evidence of 4 years of military operations. Artillery craters, destroyed buildings, and abandoned military equipment create landscapes that demonstrate the physical costs of political conflicts. You sit in a train car with Marcel, Lambert, and 12 other soldiers who are returning to civilian life after military service that exceeded original expectations for duration, intensity, and personal cost. The train moves through areas that were combat zones during various phases of the war, showing destruction that will require years to repair and landscapes that have been permanently modified by systematic explosive applications. "Look at that," Lambert says, pointing toward a village that consists mainly of foundation stones and debris piles where buildings used to stand. "How long will it take to rebuild?" Marcel examines the destroyed village and considers the relationship between destruction and reconstruction in post-war economic planning. "Years," Marcel replies, "assuming there are enough people left to do the rebuilding and enough money to pay for materials and labor." The train passes areas where forests have been reduced to broken stumps, farmland has been cratered and contaminated, and infrastructure has been destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair capabilities. You realize that the war's effects extend beyond military casualties to include environmental destruction, economic disruption, and social changes that will affect civilian populations for years after military operations end. The journey home takes 3 days due to damaged railroad infrastructure and traffic congestion from demobilization transportation requirements. You sleep in train cars, eat military rations that taste familiar but no longer necessary, and gradually adjust to the concept of traveling without expecting to be shot at. Your village appears unchanged from a distance, with the same church spire, the same cluster of stone houses, and the same agricultural fields that surround rural communities throughout France. Only when you get closer do you notice changes that indicate the war's effects on civilian populations. Many houses show signs of reduced maintenance, with roofs that need repair and gardens that haven't been properly maintained. Some houses are empty, with shuttered windows and overgrown yards that suggest the inhabitants went somewhere else and haven't returned. Your parents' cottage looks smaller than you remembered, which might be due to psychological changes in your own perspective rather than physical changes in the building. The roof has been repaired with different materials. The garden is smaller than it used to be, and the general appearance suggests careful resource management under constrained circumstances. Your mother opens the door before you reach it, which suggests she's been watching for your return. She's thinner than you remembered, and older than 4 years should account for, with grey hair that wasn't grey when you left, and lines on her face that indicate sustained worry about circumstances beyond her control. "Henry," she says, with emotions that include relief, joy, and concern that suggests she's uncertain whether you're the same person who left 4 years ago or someone different who happens to look similar. Your father appears behind her, also thinner and older, wearing clothes that have been carefully maintained but show signs of extended use and limited replacement options. His expression combines happiness about your return with assessment of your physical condition and psychological state. "You're home," your father says, which is factually accurate but captures complex emotions about survival, reunion, and transition from military service to civilian life. The reunion involves conversations that reveal the gap between military experiences and civilian experiences during the same time period. Your parents describe food shortages, increased agricultural workloads, and anxiety about family members who went to war and might not return. Your mother has maintained a garden that provided food during supply shortages, learned new cooking techniques that maximize nutrition from limited ingredients, and managed household responsibilities that were previously shared with family members who weren't available. Your father has maintained the farm with reduced labor, adapted agricultural techniques to wartime constraints, and taken responsibility for community activities that were previously managed by younger men who went to military service. Their experiences involve hardship, adaptation, and sustained uncertainty about family welfare, but don't include exposure to systematic violence, constant mortal danger, or witnessing mass casualties on a daily basis. The gap between military experiences and civilian experiences creates communication challenges that become apparent during family conversations about the war years. Was it very difficult? Your mother asks, which is a reasonable question that's impossible to answer adequately using language designed for normal social communication. You consider this question while thinking about artillery bombardments, gas attacks, trench warfare, and watching friends die from causes that range from enemy action to preventable disease. Yes, you reply, which is accurate, but incomplete in ways that would require extensive explanation to bridge the gap between military experience and civilian understanding. Your father asks about specific military events with curiosity that reflects newspaper coverage and official information that might not correspond to individual soldier experiences. Did you participate in any major battles? Your father asks, which demonstrates interest in military history rather than personal experience. Several, you reply, while remembering that battles experienced by individual soldiers mainly involve following orders, trying not to get killed, and helping other soldiers who are also trying not to get killed. These conversations continue throughout your first week home, with family members asking questions that demonstrate interest in your experiences but reveal the difficulty of communicating experiences that don't have civilian equivalents. Marcel visits after 2 weeks, walking from his own village to yours, with the deliberate pace of someone who's grown accustomed to carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain, but is now walking for social purposes rather than military necessity. How's the adjustment going? Marcel asks, while sitting in your family's kitchen and drinking coffee that tastes better than anything available during military service. Strange, you reply, while considering the psychological challenges of transitioning from environments designed around immediate survival to environments designed around normal life activities. Marcel nods with understanding that comes from shared experiences and similar adjustment challenges. I keep waking up at night listening for artillery, Marcel reports, and I feel nervous when I can't see everyone around me clearly. This information suggests that military service creates psychological adaptations that continue affecting behavior even when military threats no longer exist. Lambert visits the following week, traveling by bicycle from his family's farm, with news about other soldiers from your unit who have returned to civilian life. Dubois is having trouble sleeping, Lambert reports, and Rousseau says he can't eat meat anymore because it reminds him of things he saw during the war. These updates indicate that military service affects different people in different ways, but creates psychological changes that persist after physical dangers end. Your own adjustment to civilian life involves learning to sleep without expecting interruption by emergency alerts, eating without worrying about food supply reliability, and engaging in conversations that don't involve immediate survival planning. The physical work of farming provides familiar activities that help with psychological adjustment, though you notice that your reduced physical condition affects your ability to perform agricultural labor that was easy before military service. Your respiratory problems make heavy work difficult, particularly in cold weather when breathing becomes labored and painful. The scars on your arms and legs don't interfere with normal activities but serve as constant reminders of experiences that most people in your village never had. Winter brings news about political developments, economic changes, and social adjustments that affect the entire country as it transitions from wartime economy to peacetime economy. Factory production shifts from military equipment to civilian goods, which creates employment opportunities for veterans, but also creates competition for jobs that weren't available during wartime when most working-age men were in military service. Agricultural production must increase to feed populations that were sustained by international aid during the war, which creates opportunities for experienced farmers but also creates pressure to restore productivity on land that was damaged by military operations. Your village receives veterans who are adapting to civilian life, with varying degrees of success, creating a community of people who share military experiences but have different approaches to post-war adjustment. Some veterans adapt quickly to civilian life, finding employment, resuming relationships, and participating in community activities, as if military service was an extended interruption rather than a life-changing experience. Other veterans struggle with adjustment, experiencing health problems, psychological difficulties, and social challenges that interfere with successful transition to civilian life. Marcel finds employment at the local blacksmith shop, where his physical strength and mechanical aptitude translate effectively from military applications to civilian applications. His work involves repairing agricultural equipment, shoeing horses, and maintaining tools that support civilian economic activities. Lambert returns to his family's farm, where his agricultural experience and physical capabilities make him valuable for farming operations that require young workers who can perform physically demanding labor. You find employment helping with reconstruction work, using skills acquired during military service for building and maintaining civilian infrastructure rather than military fortifications. The work involves physical labor that's challenging given your health limitations, but provides income and social connections that support successful adjustment to civilian life. Spring brings the first planting season since the war ended, which creates opportunities to restore agricultural productivity and food security that were disrupted by military operations and resource allocation for military purposes. You help plant crops using agricultural techniques that haven't changed significantly, though the work requires more effort than it did before military service affected your physical capabilities. The community work creates social connections with neighbors who shared civilian wartime experiences and veterans who shared military experiences, building relationships that support post-war social reconstruction. Marcel visits frequently, sharing information about his own adjustment experiences and providing social support that helps with psychological transition from military service to civilian life. "I still dream about the trenches," Marcel admits during one of his visits, while helping with farm work that provides physical activity and social interaction. "But the dreams are less frequent now, and I wake up in my own bed instead of a dugout." Lambert reports similar experiences, with gradual improvement in sleep quality, reduced anxiety about personal safety, and increasing comfort with civilian social interactions. "I don't flinch when I hear loud noises anymore," Lambert reports, "and I can eat meals without checking exits and thinking about defensive positions." These updates suggest that psychological adjustment to civilian life is possible but requires time and supportive social environments that help veterans process military experiences and develop civilian life skills. Summer brings news that peace treaties have been signed, establishing political frameworks for post-war international relations and defining territorial boundaries that resulted from military operations. The Treaty of Versailles creates legal conclusions to military conflicts, assigns responsibility for war costs, and establishes mechanisms for preventing future conflicts through international cooperation and diplomatic procedures. You read about these political developments in newspapers that provide information about international affairs, though the political outcomes seem disconnected from your personal experiences of military service and post-war adjustment. The relationship between individual military service and political outcomes remains unclear, though you understand that your survival and current civilian life resulted partly from political decisions made by people you never met about conflicts you didn't fully understand. Marcel visits during harvest season, helping with agricultural work while sharing observations about the relationship between military service and civilian life that come from extended reflection on personal experiences. "I've been thinking about what we learned during the war," Marcel says, "while helping harvest crops that will provide food security for your family through the winter. Not just military skills, but about survival, cooperation, and the difference between what politicians say and what actually happens to people." You consider this observation while working with crops that represent normal life activities, food security, and economic stability that were uncertain during military service. "What did you learn?" you ask. while thinking about lessons from military service that might apply to civilian life and future challenges. Marcel pauses in his work and considers the question with the thoughtfulness of someone who spent significant time reflecting on personal experiences and their broader meaning. I learned that most people are basically decent, regardless of which side of a conflict they're on, Marcel replies. I learned that ordinary people can survive extraordinary circumstances if they help each other. And I learned that political decisions have personal consequences that politicians probably don't consider when they make those decisions. These observations capture important insights about human nature, social cooperation, and political systems that come from personal experience with military service under extreme conditions. Lambert joins the conversation, sharing his own reflections on military service and its relationship to civilian life and future planning. I learned that you can adapt to almost anything if you have to, Lambert says, but adaptation costs something that's hard to recover. And I learned that home is more valuable than you realize until you're not sure you'll ever see it again. These insights demonstrate personal growth that resulted from challenging experiences, though the growth came at costs that affect health, relationships, and life expectations in ways that will continue affecting all of you for years. As autumn arrives and the first anniversary of the armistice approaches, you attend a ceremony in your village that honors local residents who served in military service and commemorates those who didn't survive to return home. The ceremony includes speeches by local officials, prayers by the village priest, and reading of names of local residents who died during military service. The list includes people you knew before the war, people you served with during the war, and people whose deaths you witnessed personally. Jean-Baptiste's name is read, reminding you of your friend who developed trench foot and was evacuated for medical treatment, but died from complications at a field hospital before the war ended. Private Dubois' name is read, though you're uncertain which Dubois this refers to, since there were several soldiers with that surname in various units, and military record-keeping wasn't always precise about individual identification. Lieutenant Moreau's name is read, reminding you of the young officer who was killed by a sniper during your first major battle, demonstrating that military leadership training doesn't provide protection against German marksmanship. The ceremony provides community recognition of military service and individual sacrifice, creating social support for veterans and families while acknowledging the human costs of political conflicts. After the ceremony, you walk home with Marcel and Lambert, reflecting on the relationship between personal experiences and community memory, individual survival and collective loss. Do you think it was worth it? Lambert asks, which is a complex question about the relationship between personal costs and political outcomes that's difficult to answer definitively. Marcel considers this question while walking through village streets that look normal but contain residents who were changed by experiences that most civilians didn't share. I don't know if the war was worth its costs, Marcel replies, but I know that surviving it taught us things about ourselves and each other that we wouldn't have learned otherwise. And I know that we're still here to ask the question, which means something even if we can't answer it clearly. You think about this as you reach your family's cottage, where your parents are waiting with dinner and conversation that represents normal life activities, family relationships, and social stability that provide foundations for building civilian life after military service. The first anniversary of the armistice passes quietly, marked by personal reflection rather than public celebration. You spend the day working on farm repairs, thinking about friends who didn't survive to see peace, and appreciating ordinary activities that weren't available during military service. That evening, you sit with your parents in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about plans for next year's crops, community projects, and family activities that represent normal life planning and future orientation. What do you want to do now that the war is over? Your mother asks, which is a practical question about life goals and personal planning that was impossible to consider during military service. You consider this question while thinking about skills acquired during military service, health limitations that resulted from military service, and life experiences that changed your perspective on normal civilian activities. I want to help rebuild what was destroyed, you reply, and try to make sure that what we went through doesn't happen again to other people. This response captures both practical goals about post-war reconstruction and idealistic hopes about conflict prevention that come from personal experience with the costs of political conflicts. Your mother nods with understanding that suggests she recognizes both the practical value and emotional importance of these goals. That sounds like good work, she says, and work that needs people who understand what destruction costs and what peace is worth. This conversation represents the beginning of post-war life planning that builds on military experiences while focusing on civilian goals and community contributions. As winter approaches again, you reflect on the year since the armistice and consider what you've learned about transitioning from military service to civilian life, processing traumatic experiences, and building sustainable life patterns that incorporate military lessons into civilian contexts. You've learned that physical recovery from military service takes time and may never be complete, but doesn't prevent meaningful civilian activities if you adapt expectations and work methods to current capabilities. You've learned that psychological recovery from military service requires social support, productive activities, and time for processing experiences that don't have civilian equivalents. You've learned that military experiences create perspectives on civilian life that can be valuable for community problem solving, though communicating those perspectives requires patience and careful explanation. Most importantly, you've learned that survival involves both immediate physical survival during crisis situations and long-term psychological survival during normal situations that must be rebuilt after crisis situations end. Marcel and Lambert visit for Christmas dinner, creating a reunion of survivors who shared experiences that created bonds stronger than normal friendships but different from family relationships. The conversation during dinner includes discussion of current civilian activities, memories of military experiences, and plans for future activities that build on lessons learned during military service. "What do you think we'll remember about all this in 10 years?" Lambert asks, while sharing food that represents abundance and security that weren't reliable during military service. Marcel considers this question while thinking about how memory changes over time and how traumatic experiences are processed through extended reflection and social interaction. "I think we'll remember the people more than the events," Marcel replies. "We'll remember how people acted under impossible circumstances, how they helped each other, and how they maintained human dignity when everything else was being destroyed." You agree with this assessment, realizing that your strongest memories involve individual acts of kindness, courage, and mutual support rather than specific military operations or political developments. "I think we'll remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to," you add, "and that survival depends on helping each other rather than just protecting yourself." These reflections capture important lessons about human nature and social cooperation that come from shared experiences under extreme conditions, though applying these lessons to normal civilian life requires ongoing effort and social support. As the evening ends and Marcel and Lambert prepare to return to their own homes, you realize that this conversation represents a form of informal therapy that helps process military experiences through social interaction with people who shared similar experiences. The friendship that developed during military service provides ongoing social support that helps with civilian adjustment, though the friendship is different from civilian friendships because it's based on shared survival experiences rather than shared interests or activities. You understand now that your survival of World War I involved both physical survival during combat operations and psychological survival during the transition back to civilian life. Physical survival required adapting to conditions specifically designed to kill people, learning skills for avoiding immediate mortal dangers, and maintaining basic health under circumstances that weren't designed to promote human welfare. Psychological survival required processing traumatic experiences, rebuilding social relationships, and developing life goals that incorporate military lessons without being dominated by military experiences. Both types of survival required social support from people who shared similar experiences and could provide understanding that wasn't available from people who hadn't experienced military service under combat conditions. As you prepare for sleep in your own bed, in your own room, in your family's cottage, you appreciate ordinary civilian comforts that you couldn't appreciate before experiencing military discomfort. You also understand that your survival represents both individual resilience and social support systems that helped you adapt to extreme circumstances and return to normal life activities. Most importantly, you understand that survival involves responsibility to remember experiences accurately, share lessons appropriately, and contribute to community efforts to prevent similar experiences for future generations. The Great War, as people are calling it, tested human limits in ways that revealed both the worst and best aspects of human nature under extreme stress. You witnessed systematic violence, political failures, and social breakdown that demonstrated humanity's capacity for creating unnecessary suffering through poor decision-making and inadequate conflict resolution. You also witnessed individual courage, mutual support, and community resilience that demonstrated humanity's capacity for survival, adaptation, and rebuilding under circumstances that seemed impossible to survive. These experiences taught you that survival involves both individual capabilities and social cooperation, both immediate adaptation and long-term planning, both personal resilience and community support. They also taught you that ordinary people can survive extraordinary circumstances, but survival costs something that affects the rest of your life in ways that require ongoing attention and social support. Most importantly, they taught you that peace isn't just the absence of war, it's the presence of social conditions that support human welfare and prevent the political failures that create unnecessary conflicts. Now, as you drift off to sleep in safety and comfort that millions of people didn't survive to experience, you carry the responsibility of memory, the obligation of testimony, and the commitment to contribute to building social conditions that support human welfare rather than creating human suffering. Your survival of World War I wasn't just personal achievement, it was social responsibility that continues affecting your civilian life and community contributions. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that survival creates obligations to future generations, responsibilities to community welfare, and commitment to preventing the political failures that created the circumstances you somehow managed to survive. Tomorrow you'll wake up in your own bed, eat breakfast with your family, and begin another day of civilian life that's possible because you survived experiences that many people didn't survive. That survival wasn't just luck. It was the result of individual resilience, social cooperation, and human determination to maintain hope and humanity under circumstances specifically designed to destroy both. And that survival continues, requiring the same qualities that made it possible for individual resilience, social cooperation, and determination to build something better from the lessons learned through experiences that no one should have to endure, but that taught invaluable lessons about human nature, social cooperation, and the distance between political decisions and personal consequences. Sleep well, knowing that your comfortable bed, warm room, and family safety represent achievements that were earned through survival, that exceeded reasonable expectations, and created responsibilities that extend far beyond personal welfare. Your survival matters not just to you, but to everyone who benefits from the lessons you learned, the community contributions you make, and the commitment to peace that comes from understanding exactly what war costs and why peace is worth preserving. Sweet dreams from the trenches of history, where ordinary people learned extraordinary lessons about survival, cooperation, and the preciousness of ordinary life that we often take for granted until it's threatened by circumstances beyond our control, but not beyond our ability to survive, adapt, and rebuild. The war to end all wars didn't end all wars, but it taught lessons about human resilience that remain relevant for anyone facing challenges that seem impossible to survive. Those lessons live on in the stories of survivors, the memories of communities, and the commitment to building better futures that honor the sacrifices of those who didn't survive, to see peace return to a world that had temporarily forgotten how to create it. Rest well, knowing that your survival story contributes to humanity's understanding of how ordinary people can survive extraordinary circumstances and build meaningful lives from experiences that tested every limit of human endurance and revealed depths of human character that peacetime rarely requires, but that remain available when circumstances demand them. Your story of survival is complete, but its lessons continue in every choice you make about how to live a civilian life that honors both the dead and the living, both the past and the future, both the individual experience and the social responsibility that survival creates. And that, perhaps, is why these stories matter not just as historical accounts, but as ongoing reminders of human capability, social cooperation, and the responsibility that survival creates for building better futures from the lessons learned in humanity's darkest moments. Thank you for surviving to tell the story. Thank you for sharing the lessons. Thank you for carrying the responsibility that survival creates. And thank you for reminding us that peace isn't just political agreement. It's a daily choice to build social conditions that support human welfare and prevent the failures that create unnecessary suffering. Sleep well, survivors. Your work continues in peacetime, but tonight you can rest knowing that you've contributed to humanity's understanding of survival, resilience, and the obligation that comes with making it home when so many others didn't. Your story ends here, but its lessons live on in every generation that chooses cooperation over conflict, understanding over ignorance, and hope over despair. That's perhaps the greatest victory of all, not just surviving the war, but learning from it well enough to help prevent the next one. Sweet dreams from the history that you survived, the lessons that you learned, and the peace that you helped preserve for those who came after. The trenches are silent now, but their lessons echo in every choice we make about how to treat each other and how to solve our problems without turning ordinary people into soldiers who shouldn't have to learn survival skills that no civilian should need. Rest well, knowing that your survival mattered then and continues mattering now. Thank you for making it home. Thank you for sharing the story. Thank you for carrying the lessons forward. Your survival is complete. Its meaning continues,